We here in the history community on YouTube like to think of ourselves as telling the stories that don't get told. And there's values in that. There are some stories that need to be heard that aren't. But there's a difference between a story that simply isn't listened to and one that is actively silenced. Between 1932 and 1933, between 3 and 4 million Ukrainians died in a man-made famine in the Soviet Union. And the Soviet government covered it up, with the help of journalists, politicians, and academics refusing to challenge their own political narratives. This isn't just the story of a tragedy, but how that tragedy was covered up in a conspiracy of silence, and then finally brought to the light.
The communist philosophy that the end justifies the means has caused pain out of all proportion to the pitiful social progress communism's achieved. It has not hesitated to use force wherever possible to impose itself on unwilling people and to hold them in abject subjugation. Communist conspiracy is a deliberate and predictable plan of action to subvert the world. In the traditional motion picture story, the villains are usually defeated. The ending is a happy one. I can make no such promise for the picture you're about to watch. The story isn't over. You and the audience are part of the conflict. How we meet the communist challenge depends on you.
Ukraine is a frontier nation, lying along the traditional boundary between the Catholic West and the Orthodox East. Despite its ties to the West, it has been treated as the birthright of Russia for much of its history. The Russian Empire treated Ukraine as a colony, settling ethnic Russians within its borders and extracting its resources for its own use, namely grain. For centuries, Russians have feared an independent Ukraine and have tried every means available to destroy Ukrainian identity. The 19th century was the era of nationalism. Ethnic and linguistic minorities within bigger empires began to demand the right to their own states. The numerous empires of the era tried to tamp down on these nationalisms to preserve their own political cohesions. Russia's strategy was to culturally integrate these regions into the greater whole.
In the Russian Empire, this policy was Russification, which focused heavily on language. They discouraged the teaching of Ukrainian and encouraged the teaching and learning of Russian.
Intellectuals of the 19th and early 20th centuries tried to justify these policies by labeling the Ukrainian language as uncivilized and barbaric, while Soviet intellectuals would later claim that it was backwards and reactionary. The Ukrainians were hit just as much by nationalism as other peoples of Europe at the time, and the first step for them was the preservation of language. They created schools that taught in Ukrainian, started Ukrainian publications, and wrote entire operas in Ukrainian. But as the Russians tried to clamp down on the Ukrainian language, the products of Ukrainian culture became more political. As Europe plunged into the First World War, the feelings of nationalism were initially muted, but as the war started going south for the Russian Empire, they re-emerged alongside the class struggles of the late imperial era. First came the February Revolution, which removed the Tsars from power and replaced them with a Republican placeholder government under the leadership of Alexander Kerensky. Despite popular demand, the Kerensky government didn't move to end the war against the Central Powers, because it had neither the authority of divine right like the Tsars, nor the popular mandate that comes from a democratically elected government. So the plan was to hold out in the war long enough to hold an election and let that government make peace. But Vladimir Lenin and the Bolsheviks had other plans. Lenin returned to Russia in October of 1917, and on November 7th, his Bolshevik party in Petrograd initiated a coup against the government of Alexander Kerensky, which began the Russian Civil War. Prior to the October Revolution, a new state had been formed in Ukraine, which had all but declared independence for itself.
However, the Ukrainians didn't want to become part of a wider empire program for land redistribution, fearing that it would be controlled by Moscow and that all the most fertile land would be given to ethnic Russians who would continue to oppress the Ukrainians.
The Ukrainians were supported in their bid for independence by Germany, who occupied large portions of Eastern Europe. Other areas would also declare independence, such as Finland, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. And when the Bolsheviks attempted to invade Ukraine in the winter of 1918, the German army pushed them back. Lenin's government would be forced to recognize the independence of Ukraine after signing the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk in March, but this did little to stop the Soviets from trying to reconquer Ukraine as the Germans began withdrawing their forces.
It was under German occupation that the Ukrainians began to enact pogroms against the Jews, and unfortunately, they only ramped up after the Germans withdrew.
Many Jews had come to live in Eastern Europe due to pogroms and evictions by Western European governments in the Middle Ages, which forced them eastward into the old Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. As the Commonwealth was gradually picked apart by its neighbors, the Jews within its borders became subjects of the Russian Empire. Prior to the First World War, most Jews living in the Russian Empire were forced to live somewhere along the frontier between them and the rest of Europe, called the Pale of Settlement. Along with being forced to live in the frequently war-ravaged plains, they were also forbidden from owning land, and could only engage in artisan labor. When World War I broke out, many Jews had to flee their homes in the Pale of Settlement, which meant groups in the empire, including Ukrainians, were now in more regular contact with Jews.
After the February Revolution, the Kerensky government abolished all of the anti-Jewish laws, which allowed Jews to serve in government jobs as well as officer positions in the military. However, as formal anti-Semitism within the law began to fade away, the informal anti-Semitism of the peoples, especially the peasantry, began to grow. The immediate cause of this psychotic hatred, symptomatic of a society in moral and psychic crisis, was the sense that whereas everybody else had lost from the revolution, the Jews, and they alone, had benefited from it. It was a fatal conjunction. For most Russians, the appearance of Jews coincided with the miseries of communism, and so was identified with them. Despite the Ukrainians being a deeply religious group within the Russian Empire, the pogroms had little to do with their religion or even ethnicity. Jews benefited from the revolution because the laws that specifically oppressed them were lifted, but because Jews were kept out of formal society and government for so long, many, especially those who had abandoned their Jewish religion, joined revolutionary movements. Prominent socialists such as Leon Trotsky were Jewish, and whenever Red Army gangs entered a Ukrainian town, they tended to recruit local Jews into their ranks. The anti-Semitism amongst the Ukrainians at this time had more to do with their anger towards the Bolsheviks than the Jews. Once pogroms and razgrani became the order of the day, it was inevitable that Jews would be the principal victims. They were seen as aliens, they were defenseless, and were believed rich. The same instincts that led to the destruction of the country estates and raids on kulaks led to violence against Jews and their properties. The civil war in Ukraine heated up after the German withdrawal, as nationalists and communists began to fight and form their own governments. The nationalists received material aid from Austria and Germany, as well as the newly independent Poland, and were able to drive the Bolsheviks out for a time, but they eventually returned and defeated the White Army, the anarchists, and the nationalists. But why was it so important for Lenin and the Bolsheviks to retain control of Ukraine? Well, the most cynical answer would be the same as the Tsars: grain and access to warm water ports. But it was more than that. Within socialist and Marxist circles, there are a number of intellectual debates, usually formulated as the X question. You may have heard something called the Jewish question,
which is most popularly associated with the far right. But socialists ask the same kind of questions, which usually are about how a particular characteristic of a group can get in the way of achieving their political goals. For those of the far right, the Jewish question is about how can a people who are geographically spread out, landless, and have little loyalty to the country they are living in be trusted citizens of a nation-state. This question possesses a number of anti-Semitic presuppositions, and what little truth is underneath them only exists because Christian Europe actively disenfranchised the Jews for over a millennium.
Well, socialists have similar issues, and their version of the Jewish question is also based on stereotypes.
Can the Jews, who speak a different language, whose religion actively separates them from the rest of society, and who are part of an international system of bankers and financiers, be relied upon to destroy capitalism and establish socialism?
This perception of Jews is just as anti-Semitic as the far-right version. It encapsulates the stereotypes that Jews don't belong to the wider society, and that they are part of the greedy money changers of the temple. Socialists, communists, and Bolsheviks all talked about how racism and anti-Semitism were tools of the capitalists to distract the working classes from uniting to overthrow their real enemies. But this didn't stop them from holding their own weird double standards on race.
When anti-Jewish pogroms began to break out in Ukraine, Lenin and the Bolshevik leaders remained silent on the issue, because they were afraid of pushing the Ukrainian peasantry into the camp of the White Army. Within the territory the Bolsheviks controlled, they tried to stamp out overt anti-Semitism, but not because it's an ugly form of racism, but because they saw it as a disguise for anti-communism. Both the Red and White Army leaderships condemned anti-Semitism in general, but they never got more specific about individual culprits. Lenin went so far as to say that not all Jews are class enemies, but he never specified how to tell a non-class enemy Jew from one that was. And at the end of the day, the only institution in Russia that unequivocally condemned the pogroms was the Orthodox Church.
Related to the Jewish question were the national question and the peasant question, both of which addressed similar concerns.
The national question asked about whether the cultures of particular nationalities were compatible with socialism, while the peasant question asked if the peasant class was culturally compatible. Both of these questions would merge into the Ukrainian question. Ukraine was rich in agriculture but not in industry, which meant that most Ukrainians were from the peasant class. Because the Ukrainian language and culture had been repressed by the Russian government, Ukrainian culture developed an anti-Russian characteristic. On top of this, the peasant class was quite independent. They preferred to handle their own problems at the local level.
These two cultures combined made Ukraine difficult to govern in the centralized communist state that the Bolsheviks wanted to create. And in the eyes of the Ukrainians, Sovietization was just Russification under another name. And Lenin was aware of this.
On the one hand, he wants a large centralized state with the resources and coordination to fight the capitalists. On the other, he's aware that this large centralized state would be built against the wishes of minorities who had been subjected to Russian rule for centuries, and to force them into a union with their former oppressors is bad politics.
In this new socialist state, he granted minorities the right to secede from the Union, which he referred to as national self-determination.
Initially, Lenin did not believe any of the national minorities would take him up on the offer. He was under the impression that the capitalists had economically integrated the Russian Empire so thoroughly that none of the national minorities could afford to secede, but he was wrong. Most of the national minorities wanted out of his new socialist empire.
But luckily for the Bolsheviks, Lenin was intellectually dishonest, because you see, alongside national self-determination, he had another principle: proletarian self-determination, which, according to Lenin, superseded the former.
By this he meant that if, contrary to his expectations, some or even all of the borderland areas chose to leave Russia, a Bolshevik government would have the right to bring them back into the fold. If a national minority wanted to exercise their right of national self-determination in order to undermine socialism, Bolsheviks outside the nation had the right to use force to bring them back into the Union.
Basically, you're allowed to leave, so long as absolutely nothing changes when you do. After all, who is the arbiter of what proper socialism is? Lenin. So yeah, it didn't take long for Lenin to violate his own supposed principles.
After the Civil War, he began to initiate some of his desired collectivization policies, but these failed miserably. Between 1921 and 1922, there was a famine. This was partly due to a drought, but it had mostly to do with the Civil War destroying the countryside, both the Red and White armies conscripting peasants who would normally be farming, along with the destruction of incentive structures. Lenin's first plan failed so badly that not only did he have to allow an international relief effort to come into his country to distribute food, but he had to renege on his nationalization policy and allow a level of free market enterprise at the local and regional level.
Communism cannot be built without the fund of knowledge, technology, culture, but they are in the possession of the bourgeois specialists. Among them, the majority do not approve of the Soviet regime, but without them, we cannot build communism.
He also had to allow them to handle their own cultural affairs, because they were the ones in the strongest position of all the national minorities at the end of the Civil War. Unfortunately, though, these were all embarrassments to the Bolsheviks and Lenin, which is why when his successor Stalin came to power, he made sure that this didn't happen again.
After killing off, undermining, or exiling his rivals, Joseph Stalin took supreme power in the Soviet Union in 1928. Despite denouncing his rivals, including Lenin's former right hand Leon Trotsky, Stalin borrowed his plans for rapid industrialization. The USSR needed to purchase capital goods from foreign countries that it couldn't manufacture itself. However, the Soviet Union had a major hurdle. The ruble had zero value outside of the USSR. This was due in part because the Soviet ruble had no objective value within the USSR itself. Prices were centrally controlled and thus were disconnected from any market signals. On top of this, there were no financial institutions willing to lend money to the Soviet regime, who were deemed untrustworthy due to their reneging on the debts owed by the pre-revolutionary government. This meant that if the Soviets wanted to purchase Western machinery, they needed hard cash in the form of pounds, francs, marks, and dollars. To procure these funds, Stalin needed to export something that Western countries wanted: grain. For centuries, Ukraine had been the breadbasket of the Russian Empire, which exported tons of grain across Europe. The plan was simple: take the grain from Ukraine and other agricultural parts of the Union, sell it to Europe for cash, and then turn around and use the cash to buy heavy machinery. But that's easier said than done. In Ukraine, most of the peasantry were smallholders, farming on their own plots of land and selling the grain themselves. Stalin needed to take control of the land and the farmers, so he issued the first 5-year plan, a policy for rapid industrialization by mandating production quotas for agricultural products and manufactured goods. The success of the manufacturing segment of the economy would be dependent on the success of the agricultural part. The plan called for collectivization, which had been briefly attempted under Lenin, but ended due to famine and inefficiency.
The first step was reintroduction of grain requisitions, meaning that every peasant household had to provide a certain amount of grain to the government every year, and unfortunately the amount that they were usually allotted was too much for a single household to produce by themselves. And so, whenever the peasants failed to meet these quotas, Stalin blamed the kulaks, a class of people who did not exist before the revolution.
The old massive landowners of the Tsarist period were gone, and their land had been redistributed to the peasants. Some of these peasants later sold their land to other peasants when they decided to move into the cities or flee the country. But by this point, there were no large private landholders like in the old days.
The official definition of a kulak, according to Soviet authorities, was somebody who could afford to hire help to work their land. Unfortunately, what this definition tends to ignore is the fact that these kulaks tended to work their own land alongside their employees. Stalin blamed the kulaks for the failures of the 5-year plan, accusing them of withholding grain from the government.
Stalin began to push for greater collectivization. Peasants were forced to either give up their land and join a collective farm, or fulfill even higher quotas, many of which had trouble fulfilling them before. Most of the smallholders gave in and joined the collective farms, but the larger landholders initially held out, but they would face a campaign of intimidation, harassment, and false accusations. Party activists would go around and threaten many with violence, raiding their homes and taking whatever food was there to meet the quotas. And if they couldn't, they were either forced to join the collectives or accused of sabotage.
Over 1 million Ukrainians were either executed or sent to the gulags due to kulak-related accusations. In fact, the campaign of dekulakization was so successful that Stalin received complaints from peasants across the Soviet Union about it. Stalin responded to these complaints in an article he wrote for Pravda.
The Soviet government's successes in the sphere of the collective farm movement are now being spoken of by everyone. Even our enemies are forced to admit that the successes are substantial, and they really are very great. We had overfilled the 5-year plan of collectivization by more than 100%. But the successes have their steamy side, especially when they are attained with comparative ease, unexpectedly, so to speak. Such successes sometimes induce a spirit of vanity and conceit. People not infrequently become intoxicated by such successes. They become dizzy with success, lose all sense of proportion and capacity to understand realities. Why should we consolidate the successes achieved when, as it is, we can dash to the full victory of socialism?
Stalin didn't just have the party activists on his side, but also the scientists. They believed that with Marx's concept of scientific socialism, they could outplan reality.
There was an acute shortage of capital. Too many projects were begun simultaneously, and sufficient resources to finish them were lacking. The price of wheat, which the USSR exported in order to pay for its imports of foreign machinery, fell from 8.63 rubles per hundredweight in 1929 to 2.57 rubles in 1933, while prices for the machinery Stalin purchased rose by 55%. At the same time, Ukraine's agricultural burden was out of proportion to what it produced. It is daunting, with hindsight, to find so many great figures of Soviet biology queuing up to endorse collectivism, a movement that starved millions to death and was used quite deliberately as a weapon to obliterate an entire class of moderately well-off peasant, decimate the Ukraine, Russia's troublesome satellite, and subjugate the Soviet countryside.
A smaller famine occurred between 1931 and 1932, to which Stalin responded by sending grain to the needy regions. However, an even bigger famine would emerge later that year. These famines, driven by inefficient economic policy of the Soviet Union, drove more small landholders into the collective farms in hopes of finding food. Unfortunately, they would find only more of the same.
As grain shortages continued, Stalin ramped up his blaming of kulaks despite the fact that, by official Soviet definitions, there were none left. Rather, kulak became a shorthand for anyone who didn't support collectivization or the regime. The few smallholders that were left were accused of being kulaks, sometimes by party activists and other times by their neighbors, who were often being rewarded for helping uncover class enemies. And not only were they accused of withholding grain, but also of actively sabotaging the collective farms by burning crop stores and breaking tractors and threshers. As the famine worsened, peasants became more desperate. At first, they were forced to choose between killing what little livestock they had left for food or to keep them for later. Many began eating the fodder meant for the livestock. They ate bark off of trees and roots from the ground. In order to buy food in the cities, which were kept better stocked than the countryside, peasants would rob the graves of the old elite, which occasionally had gold or silver buried with them. They also began stealing wheat from the state granaries.
This became so frequent that Stalin issued the infamous Law on Socialist Property in August of 1932, which punished theft of grain with imprisonment or execution.
The peasants were sometimes allowed to keep a greater portion of their harvest if they outproduced their quotas. But in November of 1932, when the famine started getting worse, the peasants were forced to return the extra grain. The state police and party activists were sent to homes to take grain and anything else that was edible. By this point, theft from the grain stores had become so common, it was presumed that any food found in a peasant's home must have been stolen. They were also required to hand over any livestock they may have, or pay a huge fine. In response to this, many peasants decided to kill what livestock they had left, considering they couldn't afford to keep it anyways. It wasn't just smallholders that were raided by the state and party. Collective farms that failed to meet their quotas were forced to fulfill even higher quotas. Party activists raided these farms and took anything edible they could find. These collective farms were blacklisted, which meant they were not allowed to trade or receive any deliveries. The party bosses in Moscow began to put pressure on local party leaders in Ukraine, threatening them with not just loss of position within the party, but with imprisonment in the gulags if they couldn't get their region to meet their grain quotas. Party bosses in turn sent out more party activists to break into peasants' homes and find even more food. Anyone who resisted or was unable to fulfill their quotas was accused of being or aiding the kulaks. In January 1933, the borders of Ukraine were sealed off in order to prevent peasants from fleeing to other republics. There was no food in Ukraine, and Stalin was making sure the Ukrainians couldn't find any outside of it. And for an unfortunate number of desperate peasants, they resorted to cannibalism. Peasants that were sent to cities died on the streets begging for food. In Kiev alone, over 9,000 dead bodies were cleared from the streets in 1933, but less than 4,000 of them were officially counted as deaths for state records. The others were disposed of without formal recognition.
Whether the Holodomor is a genocide is debated by scholars. However, it was, in fact, entirely man-made, and entirely the result of central economic planning from the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. If that's all it was, then it would serve as the ultimate argument against socialism, communism, or at the very least Soviet-style communism. That would be bad enough. But the evidence substantiates my view and that of a number of other historians that Joseph Stalin did indeed engage in genocidal efforts against the Ukrainian people. Joseph Stalin frequently received letters from people across the Soviet Union, and we know for a fact that he was receiving letters from people in Ukraine in the fall of 1932, telling him that there was no food. In fact, in July of that year, the party bosses of Ukraine told Moscow that they could not meet the grain quotas.
The Ukrainian communists continued to press for further concessions. The Ukrainian officials argued that the quotas were too high, that the Ukrainian peasants were starving, and that the agricultural crisis was objective. Stalin's representatives blamed the Ukrainians for the crisis, rolled out any further concessions, and ordered the plan to be fulfilled unconditionally by January 1st, 1933. All Komsomol members in Ukraine were purged for violating party discipline and arrested. Stalin and the leaders of the Communist Party knew that famine was happening, and what did they do? They intentionally made it worse. They put policies in place that didn't just call for procuring more grain, but to take food away from those who had it.
They created an atmosphere that incentivized starving the Ukrainians to death by sending people into their homes and stealing what little food they had left. And then, they blocked off all the roads, preventing Ukrainians from leaving or supplies from coming in, making sure that not only could they not find food, but they also couldn't leave to tell people what was happening.
The Holodomor was the most successful genocide in the history of mankind when it comes to achieving its intended goals. Stalin got the grain so he could export it, get heavy machinery, and industrialize the Soviet Union. On top of this, they collectivized the farms, which makes the peasants and food supply easier to control.
Furthermore, they were able to debilitate the political threat that was the Ukrainian national movement by starving between 3 and 4 million Ukrainians to death in a 12-month period. And they were able to do it, all the while keeping it hidden from the rest of the world.
In the years that followed the famine, Ukrainians were forbidden to speak about what had happened. They were afraid to mourn publicly. Even if they had dared to do so, there were no churches to pray in, no tombstones to decorate with flowers. When the state destroyed the institutions of the Ukrainian countryside, it struck a blow against public memory as well. There was no official acknowledgement of the famine. The Soviet authorities referred to any such claim as reactionary propaganda meant to undermine Soviet communism, and the denial of the famine began before the worst phases of it had even begun.
You weren't supposed to talk about the famine. Doing so could find you on a one-way trip to Siberia or lined up against the wall and buried in a shallow grave. But that didn't stop the rumors from spreading amongst high-ranking families in the Soviet Union, those who benefited most from the starvation of the Ukrainians. The war was never officially banned, but it was unofficially censured by a culture of obedience and fear.
Members of the Ukrainian Communist Party would use the word in private communications, but while discussing it in public or at conferences, the word could get you killed. Instead, they had to use euphemisms such as problems or difficulties. One brave Ukrainian party boss from Kharkiv, Roman Terekov, was bold enough to use the word famine in front of Joseph Stalin. Stalin responded to this assertion by saying,
"You spin this yarn about famine thinking that you'll intimidate us, but it won't work. Go to the Writers' Union and write fairy tales for idiots to read."
Not long after, he found himself removed from the party leadership in Ukraine. Records are silent on what happened after. After the roads leading out of Ukraine were closed off, Ukrainian soldiers serving in the Red Army stopped receiving mail from home. Ukrainians who joined the army after the famine were publicly rebuked or punished if they brought up the famine. A Ukrainian soldier who joined the Red Army in 1934 was attacked by his political instructor when he asked about the famine.
There was no famine and there cannot be. You will be locked up for 10 years if you keep talking like this.
During the famine, many Ukrainian peasants stopped working altogether because of malnutrition. In order to bring in the harvest, Moscow sent students and other volunteers from the cities to the Ukrainian countryside in order to collect the grain. What they saw traveling around Ukraine was horrifying. Miles and miles of untilled fields with empty houses with dead bodies on the sides of the roads. The students and workers were under strict orders to never speak of what they saw in Ukraine.
At work, no one spoke of the famine or of the bodies in the streets, as if we were all part of a conspiracy of silence. Only with the closest and most trusted of friends would we talk about the terrible news from the villages. The rumours were confirmed when the townspeople were ordered to the countryside to help with the harvest, and saw for themselves whence had come the living skeletons that haunted our city's streets.
As the deaths piled up, doctors were roped into the conspiracy. Doctors were told to invent other causes for the death from the famine. Infectious disease and cardiac arrest were common. It got so bad that even village party secretaries were swollen with hunger. An atmosphere of fear and blind loyalty motivated the silence among doctors. It was considered to be anti-party, reprehensible, even to react to them.
The death registration books were removed from many villages. The party claimed that the kulaks had taken control of death reporting and were artificially raising the numbers. On the back end, whether or not someone was willing to fabricate death records became an unofficial test of loyalty to the party. Those that refused could, at best, find themselves out of a job, or at worst, find themselves in a mass grave, buried with the peasants they weren't willing to lie about.
Despite trying to silence the doctors, students, workers, soldiers, and public functionaries, the Communist Party had another problem: the census. Soviet planners had made charts and graphs forecasting greater population growth. Keeping these numbers would prove to the world that the Soviet system was truly the best. The population of the Soviet Union and of Ukraine were certainly higher than they were in 1926, when they took the last census. But in 1937, the numbers were much lower than anticipated. The total had grown from 147 million to 162 million. The planners had forecasted the population being somewhere between 170 and 180 million. A committee collected the data for the census, and then Stalin edited it. He was angry at the data, especially at the much lower population levels, with particularly low rates in Kazakhstan, the Volga, the North Caucasus, and Ukraine, the areas hit hardest by the famine. The committee in charge of the census ordered thousands of villages to be surveyed in order to find the missing 8 million people from the population estimates, and found fewer than 5,000. The men running the census were arrested in March of 1937, accused of being class enemies. They were replaced by a new set of men who were shortly thereafter arrested as well. This continued until Stalin found a compliant set of statisticians who were willing to fudge the numbers. The 1937 census was never officially published, and a new census was released in 1939 that claimed the Soviet Union had grown to over 170 million people, hitting the low end of the projected growth rates.
How did they get these numbers, you ask? Well, what they did was they applied the census data from the gulags to regions of the Soviet Union that were hit hardest by the famine in order to pad their counts.
On top of this, Joseph Stalin had over 120,000 ethnic Russians resettled in the regions of eastern Ukraine depopulated by the famine. But this wouldn't be enough to fix all the numbers in Ukraine, because the census also asked about nationality. The statisticians claimed that the number of Ukrainians seemed to not grow as much as the other national groups because many Ukrainians stopped self-identifying as Ukrainian and identified as Russian instead. Stalin had this to say about the new census.
Under the sun of the great socialist revolution, an astonishingly rapid, never-before-seen increase in population is taking place. Mighty socialist industry has called into life new professions. Tens of thousands of people who yesterday were unskilled laborers today have become qualified masters in the most diverse branches of production. Millions of peasant smallholders eking out a beggarly life have become prosperous collective farmers, creators of socialist harvests. The all-union census of the population must show all of the great changes that have happened in the life of the people, the growth of the cultural and material level of the masses.
Despite all these repressions, the Ukrainians did keep the story alive. It became part of the oral tradition of the Ukrainian countryside. Many kept diaries of what happened in those years, diaries that had to be kept secret from the authorities, hidden under floorboards or buried in the yard, because if you were found in possession of such a record, you could find yourself on a one-way trip to the gulags. But some Ukrainians managed to escape the Soviet Union, and tell their stories to outsiders.
Now, keeping a secret inside your own totalitarian state is easy enough, but what about the rest of the world? Well, luckily for Stalin and the Communist Party, they had willing collaborators among the sycophants and fellow travelers of the Fourth Estate.
Western journalists first began arriving in the Soviet Union after the February and October revolutions, covering it and the Russian Civil War and the aftermath of the Great War. Once the dust began to settle, access became more restricted to journalists. There had been censorship of the media during the Tsarist period, but the restrictions became more onerous. Most foreign correspondents were confined to reporting from within Moscow or Leningrad, and all they had to go on were official reports and propaganda from the Soviet Union. Some felt stifled under these restrictions, while others embraced them. A pair of British socialists, Beatrice and Sidney Webb, visited the Soviet Union numerous times throughout the 1930s. They had been founding members of the London School of Economics and the Fabian Society. They visited the USSR during the famine and denied that any starvation was going on upon returning home. The two of them were believers in the cause and chose to lie about the famine in order to protect the movement.
The experience of the last 3 harvests seems to justify the claim of the Soviet Union that the initial difficulties of this giant transformation have been overcome.
An American communist, Louis Fisher, was an ardent defender of Stalin, rejecting any notion of there being food shortages in the Soviet Union.
In the Poltava, Vinnytsia, Podolsk, and Kiev regions, conditions will be hard. I think there is no starvation anywhere in Ukraine now. After all, they've just gathered in the harvest. But it was a bad harvest.
And after the famine, he wrote,
"During all those hard years, the state endeavored to beautify life. The opera, the ballet, and many theaters displayed a dazzling richness of scene and costume incomparably greater than elsewhere in the world. Parks of culture and rest were established throughout the country to provide sensible recreation and civilized leisure. All governments are based on force. The question is only of the degree of force, who administers it, and for what purpose. Force which eliminates oppressors and exploiters, creates work and prosperity, and guarantees progress and economic security will not be resented by the great masses of people."
He was so deep into the Stalinist camp that in 1938, Leon Trotsky referred to him as a merchant of lies and the direct literary agent of Stalin.
There were smaller famines happening right before the Holodomor, but the Soviets were eager to impress foreign celebrities who shared their political dreams. In 1931, the Irish playwright and fellow Fabian Society member, George Bernard Shaw, visited the Soviet Union, where he was welcomed as an honored guest among the party elites. While at a banquet in Moscow, George Bernard Shaw told a story about how his friends gave him large sums of canned food to take with him before visiting Russia, out of fear he wouldn't find any while there. In supreme confidence, he told the Soviet banqueters, "They thought Russia was starving, but I threw all the food out the window in Poland before I reached the Soviet frontier."
The audience was reported to have gasped at that revelation. That canned meat would have been worth a small fortune in the workers' paradise. And that was before the famine a year later.
George Bernard Shaw was shown around to all the usual spots Soviets took celebrities for propaganda purposes, but there were some journalists who wanted to do their jobs. In 1932, a pair of Canadian women illegally drove across the Soviet Union until they were deported while in Tbilisi. One of these women, Rhea Kleiman, was a journalist who came to report on the Soviet reforms and saw the horrors of labor camps and eventually miles and miles of depopulated villages, emptied by the famine. Her stories are widely cited today by Western scholars talking about the famine, but in her own day her accounts were ignored, partly because she was a woman, but mostly because she wrote for a smaller newspaper of far less prestige. There were some publications in Germany that talked about the famine in the Soviet Union before it happened. A German politician and polymath, Otto Hosch, visited the Soviet Union frequently throughout the 1920s and early 1930s, and he founded the scholarly journal Obscurity, which still exists today. The journal began reporting on agricultural issues in the Soviet Union a year before the famine began, showing that Ukraine and the USSR was already in poor condition before the actual Holodomor began.
Another tricky type of evidence for the Holodomor is visual. Pictures coming from out of Ukraine at this time are difficult to verify. And when some people have tried depicting the Holodomor, they'll use pictures from earlier famines in the 1920s. And the deniers will use this as a jumping off point to say that the entirety of the famine is a fabrication.
But luckily there is at least one set of pictures that were undeniably from the Holodomor. An Austrian chemical engineer, Alexander Wienerberger, who was working in Kharkiv during the famine, managed to take 100 pictures that depict long lines of hungry people waiting at grocery stores, starving children, dead bodies lying on the side of the roads, and mass graves. He left the Soviet Union in 1934, and when he returned home to Austria, his pictures were published by the Patriotic Front in a book called Russia as It Really Is, and republished in 1935 as Should Russia Starve? France was probably the least informed on the issue of the famine. French communists defended the Soviet Union from claims of the famine in order to protect the fatherland of socialism. One French communist, Paul Vaillant-Cottier, who visited the Soviet Union numerous times, wrote this in 1932, regurgitating Soviet propaganda. It only went well since we were able to remove the kulaks. Here there was one of them that had been able to take control of the kolkhoz. By agreement with the former kulaks, he threatened people who did not enter the kolkhoz with enthusiasm. Comrade Stalin's letter arrived and we expelled the kulak. Then the kulaks set fire to the harvest, they killed the Komsomol, we made them stop one night. Today, almost everyone is a kolkhozian and works happily. Even ardent anti-communists didn't take up the story. They preferred to focus on Lenin's seizure of power, anti-religious persecutions, and later the Great Purges. They saw what little news of the famine reached them as failures of policy rather than a deliberate act of malice by Stalin.
Stories were published in France, but only after the worst parts of the famine were already over, and those that did had very small circulations. One French writer wrote in Le Petit Messiah saying,
"This famine is due mainly to the will of the Soviets, who seek by this means to punish the Ukraine for their long national resistance. The history of Ukraine and the Red Terror which prevails there is one of the most lamentable of the post-war period."
However, in October of 1933, a 54-page document was published in Brussels, titled Famine in Ukraine. It was intended for a French audience, and it had highly detailed maps about the varying levels of effect of famine across Ukraine. In it, it said,
"As the opponents in Ukraine are counted in millions, a general famine was necessary to subdue them." As the famine got worse, the restrictions placed on foreign correspondence became more onerous. Journalists needed to maintain good relations with the Soviet regime in order to remain in the country. Since the Soviet government controlled all telegraph lines, this meant that any story a journalist wanted to publish had to go through Soviet censors, and if they didn't like it, they would refuse to send it. A journalist could have a negative story about the Soviet Union hand-delivered to their newspaper through a courier or a diplomat, but as soon as the Soviets discovered who wrote the negative piece, that journalist would be deported and banned from ever entering the country again.
Works under a sword of Damocles. The threat of expulsion from the country or of the refusal of permission to re-enter it. Officially, there was no famine. To anyone who lived in Russia in 1933 and who kept his eyes and ears open, the historicity of the famine is simply not in question.
On top of this, the restrictions to leave Moscow became tighter, with all requests to visit Ukraine being rejected.
We were summoned to the press department one by one and instructed not to venture out of Moscow without submitting a detailed itinerary and having it officially sanctioned. In effect, therefore, we were summarily deprived of the right of unhampered travel in the country to which we were accredited.
Some brave journalists actually ventured out of Moscow, such as Malcolm Muggeridge, who wrote for the Manchester Guardian. "It was the big story in all of our talks in Moscow. Everybody knew about it. There was no question about that. Anyone you were talking to knew that there was a terrible famine going on. Even in the Soviets' own pieces there were somewhat disguised acknowledgement of the great difficulties there. The attacks on the kulaks, the admission that people were eating the seed grain and cattle. I realized that was the big story. I could see that all correspondents in Moscow were distorting it. Without making any kind of plans or asking for permission, I just went and got a ticket for Kiev and then went on to Rostov. Ukraine was starving, and you only had to venture out to smaller places to see derelict fields and abandoned villages. On a recent visit to the North Caucasus and Ukraine, I saw something of the battle that is going on between the government and their peasants. The battlefield was as desolate as in any war, and stretches wider. On one side, millions of peasants, starving, often their bodies swollen with lack of food. On the other, soldiers, members of the GPU, carrying out the instructions of the dictatorship of the proletariat. They had gone over the country like a swarm of locusts and taken away everything edible. They had shot and exiled thousands of peasants, sometimes whole villages. They had reduced some of the most fertile land in the world to a melancholy desert. Muggeridge wrote a report on his trip and had it spirited out of the Soviet Union in a diplomatic bag. However, when the report reached the Manchester Guardian, the editors removed his critique of the Soviet Union due to political disagreements, and it was published under a pseudonym so that Muggeridge wouldn't be deported.
Probably the most famous story of a Western journalist risking their life to expose the truths of the famine was that of a Welsh journalist and his feud with the Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist of the New York Times.
Gareth Jones was a freelancer at the time he was hired as the foreign affairs advisor to former Prime Minister David Lloyd George. Thanks to these connections, he became the first foreign journalist to fly in a plane with Adolf Hitler, where he interviewed him for an article in the Western Mail. Prior to the famine, he visited the Soviet Union twice, and reported on the less than stellar situation in the countryside, reporting on the smaller 1931 to 1932 famine in Ukraine. He visited the Soviet Union for a third and final time in March of 1933, and visited Ukraine, only managing to do so by escaping his handler at a train stop and catching a ride on another train full of starving workers. He leaves the Soviet Union in late March and issues a press release in Berlin.
Everywhere was the cry, "There is no bread, we are dying." This cry came from every part of Russia, from the Volga, Siberia, White Russia, the North Caucasus, Central Asia. In the train, a communist denied to me that there was a famine. I flung a crust of bread, which I had been eating for my own supply, into a spittoon. A peasant fellow passenger fished it out and ravenously ate it. I threw an orange peel into the spittoon, and the peasant again grabbed it and devoured it. The communists subsided. I stayed overnight in a village where there used to be 200 oxen and where there are now 6. Peasants were eating the cattle fodder and had only a month's supply left. They told me that many had already died of hunger. 2 soldiers came to arrest a thief. They warned me against travel by night as there were too many starving, desperate men. "We are waiting for death," was my welcome. "See, we still have our cattle fodder. Go further south. There they have nothing. Many houses are empty of people already dead," they cried.
His story would be picked up by more conservative outlets such as the New York Evening Post and the Chicago Daily News, but most journalists were either fellow travelers or sympathetic to the Soviet cause, and were hostile towards anyone who publicly published bad news about the Soviet Union. Gareth Jones became the first journalist to publicly call out the famine in the Soviet Union under his own name. Malcolm Muggeridge and the few others who had done so under pseudonyms, and often their editors toned down the criticisms of the Soviets. On March 31st, the Pulitzer-winning New York Times journalist, Walter Durrante, published a response to Jones.
There appears from a British source a big scare story in the American press about famine in the Soviet Union, with thousands already dead and millions menaced by death and starvation. Its author is Gareth Jones, who recently spent 3 weeks in the Soviet Union and reached the conclusion that the country was on the verge of a terrific smash. It appeared that he had made a 40-mile walk through villages in the neighborhood of Kharkiv and found conditions sad. I suggested that was a rather inadequate cross-section of a big country, but nothing could shake his conviction of impending doom. To put it brutally, you can't make an omelet without breaking eggs.
Jones responded to Durrante's rebuttal.
Censorship has turned them into masters of euphemism and understatement. Hence they give famine the polite name of food shortage, and starving to death is softened down to read as widespread mortality from diseases due to malnutrition.
Not long after the Jones story broke, the Soviets arrested 6 British engineers working in Soviet factories, accusing them of espionage. It was suspected by Jones and numerous other journalists that this was done in response to the story in order to keep other journalists silent, not wanting to put the engineers in danger. So everyone else in the Moscow press corps joined with Durrante in piling in on Jones.
We all received urgent queries from our home offices on the subject, but the inquiries coincided with preparations underway for the trial of the British engineers. The need to remain on friendly terms with the censors, at least for the duration of the trial, was for all of us a compelling professional necessity. Throwing down Jones as unpleasant, a chore as fell any of us in years of juggling the facts to please dictatorial regimes. But throw him down we did, unanimously and in almost identical formulas of equivocation. The scene in which the American press corps combined to repudiate Jones is fresh in my mind. Forced by competitive journalism to jockey for the inside track with officials, it would have been professional suicide to make an issue of the famine at this particular time. There was much bargaining in a spirit of gentlemanly give and take. A formula of denial was worked out. We admitted enough to soothe our consciences, but in roundabout phrases that damned Jones as a liar.
Shortly after the Jones story broke, Louis Fisher was asked about a story of 1 million people dying in Kazakhstan, to which he responded,
Who counted them? How could anyone march through a country and count 1 million people? Of course people are hungry there, desperately hungry. Russia is turning over from agriculture to industrialism. It's like a man going into business on small capital.
However, when talking to an audience of college students in Oakland, California a week later, he said,
There is no starvation in Russia.
Walter Durrante had been reporting from the Soviet Union since 1922, and had been awarded a Pulitzer in 1932. To the rest of the world, it was his word against the nobodies.
Despite Durrante being the prized writer of his time, his reputation has since deteriorated. Many of his contemporaries would later go on to talk about how he was a tool of the Soviets, feeding communist propaganda to the West through the trusted hands of the New York Times.
Durrante was the villain of the whole thing. It is difficult for me to see how it could have been otherwise, that in some sense he was not in the regime's power. He wrote things about the famine and the situation in Ukraine which were laughably wrong. There is no doubt whatever that the authorities could manipulate him. Eugene Lyons later recounted a dinner he had with Walter Durrante.
He gave us his fresh impressions in brutally frank terms, and they added up to a picture of ghastly horror. His estimate of the dead from famine was the most startling I had as yet heard from anyone. But Walter, you don't mean that literally, Mrs. Cormack explained. Hell, I don't. I'm being conservative, he replied. And as if by way of consolation, he added his famous truism, but they're only Russians. Once more that same evening, we heard Durrante make the same estimate in answer to a question by Lawrence Stallings. When the issues of the Times carrying Durrante's own articles reached me, I found that they failed to mention the large figures he had given freely and repeatedly to all of us.
Durrante communicated the reality of the famine to other journalists at the New York Times. A soon-to-be former fellow traveler, John Chamberlain, recounted his own story of hearing Walter Durrante speak openly about the famine.
To a group in the Times elevator, Durrante had almost casually mentioned that 3 million people had died in Russia in what amounted to a man-made famine. Durrante, who had floated the theory that revolutions were beyond moral judgment, you can't make an omelet without breaking eggs, did not condemn Stalin for the bloody elimination of the kulaks that had deprived the Russian countryside of necessary sustaining expertise. He just simply let the 3 million figure go at that. What struck me at the time was the double iniquity of Durrante's performance. He was not only heartless about the famine, he had betrayed his calling as a journalist by failing to report it.
Chamberlain mentioned the famine in his review of Escape from the Soviets, one of the earliest memoirs of a survivor or escapee from the gulags, which got him censured by American communists and Soviet sympathizers. These groups held so much sway at the New York Times that Chamberlain almost lost his job. It was only when another socialist who had heard Durrante talk about the famine corroborated his story that he was saved. Louis Fisher would leave the Soviet Union during Stalin's purges, and gradually became disillusioned with communism, going on to contribute to the 1949 compendium, The God That Failed. Walter Durrante was one of the most important figures in Franklin Delano Roosevelt's decision to grant diplomatic recognition to the Soviet Union. After he was inaugurated, he requested a meeting with Durrante to talk about the state of the Soviet Union. Durrante also spoke with foreign diplomats stationed in Moscow, as well as the other European capitals, and in these conversations he spoke of the famine and about casualties nearing 10 million. Walter Durrante was a Pulitzer winner, and do you know what he won his Pulitzer for?
His reporting on the successes of farm collectivization during the first 5-year plan. Durrante knowingly lied about the exact thing he was reporting on, and thanks to the politics of the era, nobody believed anybody who contradicted him.
Durrante, never an idealist like Fisher, could not be disillusioned because he had no illusions in the first place. In later years, when Soviet philism had gone out of fashion, Durrante lied about ever having lied in the first place. In his last book, published in 1949, he wrote, "Whatever Stalin apologists might say, 1932 was a year of famine," and he claimed to have said so at the time. And, as we have seen, he had, but not in the dispatches to the New York Times.
Durrante wasn't the only liar in the Moscow press corps. Most of them collaborated with Soviet propagandists to one degree or another. But it wasn't just the Soviet censors they were trying to appease, but rather also the progressive elites back in their own countries.
By 1934, faith in the Soviet experiment had become the intellectual fashion among the people for whose good opinion I cared most. It was clear to me what sort of account of Russia the intellectual elite preferred to hear. The editors of a liberal weekly invited me to a staff luncheon. I was given an opening to denounce books about Russia that had told too much. By stretching my conscience, I might have assured them that a new era of liberalism had dawned under the Soviets. But the Ukrainian famine, the valuta horrors, the death decrees, and heresy hunts still smarted in my memory. I alluded to a few of these things. A chill seemed to come over the luncheon. Apparently I had committed the offense of puncturing noble illusions. The Olympian irony of the situation, I could not help thinking of it, was that these men, their exact kind, were being stamped out in the Soviet land like so many insects. They fitted perfectly into the category of pre-revolutionary intellectuals, who must hide in the dark cracks, praying for only one boon, not to be noticed. Other intellectuals were no less frightened of the truth. They asked questions about Russia and appeared horrified if I failed to give the prescribed answer. Indeed, it seemed to me that these men and women, insulted to the marrow by the inequities of bourgeois society, were wiping out the insult Japanese fashion by committing intellectual harakiri. The desire to belong, not to be a political dog in the manger, was a powerful inducement to silence, or at least to cautious understatement.
But whatever happened to that one brave journalist, Gareth Jones, who slipped his Soviet handlers in order to explore the Ukrainian countryside and document the horrors of the famine? He returned home, published some articles on what he saw, but was largely ignored by the bigger progressive newspapers and the politicians.
Like all journalists who published negative stories about the Soviet Union, he was banned from the country. So in late 1934, he decided to go on a tour of East Asia. He visited Japan, where he interviewed numerous important generals and politicians. From there, he went to Beijing and to Inner Mongolia, part of the Japanese puppet state of Manchukuo. While there, he was kidnapped by bandits, who demanded a ransom. Both Chinese and Japanese authorities tried to get in touch with the kidnappers, but to no avail. On August 8th, the kidnappers handed Jones over to another group. And on August 12th, 1935, the day before his 30th birthday, Jones was killed. Chinese authorities found his body on August 17th, with 3 gunshot wounds. His former employer, Lloyd George, said this in response to Jones's death. That part of the world is a cauldron of conflicting intrigue, and one or another interest concerned probably knew that Mr. Gareth Jones knew too much of what was going on. He had a passion for finding out what was happening in foreign lands, wherever there was trouble, and in pursuit of his investigations he shrank from no risk. I had always been afraid that he would take one too many. Nothing escaped his observation, and he allowed no obstacle to turn him from his course when he thought that there was some fact which he could obtain. He had the almost unfailing knack of getting at things that mattered. Mr. Jones, along with a German journalist, Herbert Müller, traveled by car to Inner Mongolia. They were both kidnapped, but the bandits let Müller go, supposedly to secure the ransom money. But the bandits had other ways of contacting authorities. 2 days after letting Müller go, they killed Jones.
Why? Well, investigators would later find that the man who lent Müller and Jones that car was an NKVD agent. There's also strong evidence that suggests that Müller may have been one as well. Gareth Jones would die a largely discredited figure, while Walter Durrante would die with his reputation largely intact. With all the cover-ups by Western journalists and the Soviet regime, is it possible that the United States or other governments of Western Europe could have not known about the famine? No. They knew. They knew and chose not to do anything. They refused to listen to the advice of their journalists, spies, and ambassadors.
Of all the governments in the world, the Polish government was the most aware of the ongoing famine and other failures of Soviet policy, because most refugees fleeing the Soviet Union did so through Poland, which had a sizable Ukrainian population along its eastern border.
The Polish government treated Ukrainians as second-class citizens, placing many of the same restrictions on the Ukrainian language that the Russian Empire had. But they went a step even further and refused to call them Ukrainians, but instead Ruthenians.
These restrictions resulted in numerous Ukrainian nationalist organizations to emerge, such as the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, which orchestrated assassinations and other acts of terrorism. When the Soviet Union signed the Non-Aggression Pact with Poland in 1931, both were on the same page when it came to the Ukrainian question. However, this didn't stop Polish diplomats from communicating atrocities committed by the Soviets to their own government or to other diplomats across Europe.
Mass arrests and persecutions cannot be explained or justified by peril on the part of the Ukrainian national movement. The real cause of the action lies in the planned, far-sighted, long-term policy of Moscow leaders who are more and more becoming imperialists, strengthening the political system and borders of the state.
People outside of government service knew that there was a famine going on in the Soviet Union, and many of these professionals, such as economists, professors, and journalists, sent warnings to the US State Department as early as 1931. Walter Durrante himself told an American diplomat in Berlin.
Durrante pointed out that, quote, in agreement with the New York Times and the Soviet authorities, his official dispatches always reflect the official opinion of the Soviet regime and not his own.
The New York Times never issued a disclaimer about this policy. Durrante also told a British diplomat that there may have been as many as 10 million people dead from the famine in 1933. Since 1917, the United States had not granted diplomatic recognition to the Soviet Union, and therefore didn't have any ambassadors or consuls in the USSR. However, the US did keep an eye on what was going on, especially in export markets, considering the main export of the Soviet Union was grain, which competed with the US by selling it below market values. More direct info about the Soviet Union was obtained through Polish or Latvian diplomats, who reported the Soviet land seizures, localized outbreaks of famine, and large numbers of refugees crossing into Romania and Poland to American diplomats in Riga and Warsaw. The US legation in Riga sent this message to the State Department in July of 1932 based on reports from other diplomatic missions to the Soviet Union.
At the beginning of the quarter, the agricultural situation was scarcely favorable. There was a general lack of agricultural products, which made itself felt in numerous difficulties with the food supply and with the supply of seed grain to certain districts. The situation in the Ukraine was particularly unfavorable, and if it had not been for successful sowing operations in some of the newer agricultural regions, the failure of the Ukraine would have presented the country with a very serious situation.
Which was followed by another message in August.
Taking into account the fact that grain production in Russia is still below pre-war and the fact that the country's population increases at the rate of 2% per annum, the decline of the grain area is a phenomenon the economic significance of which cannot be underrated. Despite the impression to the contrary created by the wording of the decree of May 6, 1932, the grain procurement plan for 1932 embodied in the above-mentioned decree provides no relief to the peasants.
In March of 1933, he sent this report to the newly inaugurated Roosevelt administration.
The study of these developments over a period of several years leaves the indelible impression that the present condition of Russian agriculture is not the result of any criminal acts of a group of persons, but are the effects of the reaction of the peasantry as a whole, and in Russia that means the preponderant majority of the country's population, to a government policy which has deprived it of individual ownership in respect of most of its property, and which has robbed it of the incentive to work. Viewed in this light, the severe punishment which has been meted out to the 75 officials appears essentially as an act of terror undertaken with the double object of crushing criticism of Stalin's policy among government executives and concealing the true reasons of its failure by shifting the responsibility to quarters where it does not properly belong.
The The messages from diplomats continued through most of 1933, but in November of that year, President Roosevelt granted diplomatic recognition to the Soviet Union. Why? In short, it was the Great Depression. After the stock market crashed in 1929, the conservative atmosphere vanished as governments tried all sorts of policies to jumpstart economic growth. And one of these was foreign trade. Not only was the US not openly trading with the Soviet Union at the time, but shortly after the US Senate passed the Smoot-Hawley tariff, which hampered exports. At the same time, the Soviet Union was blasting its propaganda around the world through local communist parties, boasting of how there was no depression in the USSR. Everyone who wanted a job had one. Free housing, free food, it was the workers' paradise. And a lot of people, especially among progressive elites and technocrats, believed them. The rest of the world could barely hold it together, while the Soviets were on a spending spree. That was the image being presented to the world. Candidate and then later President Roosevelt not only wanted to open up trade with the Soviets, but he also believed he could get the Soviets to repay some of the debts owed to the US by the Tsarist regime. He was also interested in Soviet economic policy and possibly implementing it in the US, which is why he requested a meeting with Walter Durrante, who, after all, had won a Pulitzer for his reporting on the successes of the 5-year plan. On top of this, Roosevelt was a progressive, and support for the Soviet system was the progressive norm at the time. Durrante was only the most evident symptom of something far more pervasive. A climate of opinion which made telling the truth about Stalinism almost an offense against good taste in enlightened circles.
American diplomats not only tried to warn President Roosevelt about the man-made famine in Ukraine, they tried to disabuse him of the notion that opening trade relations with the Soviet Union would lead to economic growth in the United States.
Any talk that the USSR, where agriculture is ruined, where industry is on the verge of anarchy, and where the population is starving, will make enormous purchases in the United States is nothing else than Soviet propaganda.
Not only was Roosevelt warned about the famine by experts in his government, but also by letters received from relatives of famine victims in the US. Dear Master of our country, President Roosevelt, I have a stepsister in Russia alone with 4 small children and starving, if we cannot help her a little. I have heard that you gave orders not to send money out of our country. Is it possible that I could get your permission to send an order for her to the American store, out there not far from her hometown, to get things to eat? It's not so easy to know you have sisters that's starving and you can't. Raise a hand to help, so I'm asking you to help if possible, so I can do what little I can, and God will reward you for your kindness. I'm sure I will pray for your protection of your enemies. God alone can save you, and no man on earth can stand before him. Closing with God's blessings to you and the missus, I thank you. Truly yours, Anna Whitkop.
Ukrainian emigre communities in both the United States and Canada wrote letters to President Roosevelt trying to warn him about not opening relations with the Soviets and about the famine going on in Ukraine. Sometimes these letters would be delivered to high-ranking members of the Democratic Party, hoping that they could get it to President Roosevelt. But when they found out what these letters were about, they made sure that they never saw the light of day, because if they did, it could politically damage President Roosevelt.
After granting recognition to the Soviet Union on November 16th, numerous protests in both the US and Canada were held by Ukrainian emigres. One protest on November 18th saw 8,000 Ukrainians march in New York, who were harassed by 500 members of the local Communist Party, who stole pamphlets, spat at them, hurled racial epithets, and attempted to assault them. A similar instance was seen in Chicago a month later, which resulted in 100 recorded injuries. There can also be no doubt that both the State Department and the White House had access to plentiful and timely intelligence concerning the famine of 1932-33 in Ukraine and made a conscious decision not only to do nothing about it, but never to acknowledge it publicly. For political reasons largely related to FDR's determination to establish and maintain good relations with the USSR, the US government participated, albeit indirectly, in what is perhaps the single most successful denial of genocide in history. Despite the protests, President Roosevelt sent his first ambassador to the Soviet Union, William Bullitt. Bullitt, like Roosevelt, had high expectations for relations with the Soviets, but like all other diplomats sent to the USSR, he was quickly disillusioned.
A nation ruled by fanatics who are ready to sacrifice themselves and everyone else for their religion of communism, neither Stalin nor any other leader of the Communist Party has deviated in the slightest from the determination to spread communism to the ends of the earth.
Roosevelt replaced Bullitt with Joseph Davies in 1936, at whose insistence the administration eliminated the Division of Eastern European Affairs, reduced the Russian Affairs section of the Riga Legation, and sent anti-Soviet diplomats into political exile in less important countries such as Turkey. Despite all of this, the Soviet ambassador, Alexander Troyanovsky, continued complaining that all American Foreign Service officers were reactionaries. On May 28, 1934, Congressman Hamilton Fish Jr. of New York introduced House Resolution 399.
Resolved by the House of Representatives, the Senate concurring, the Congress hereby condemns the systematic disregard for human life and for human and national rights and liberties that characterizes the policy of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, expresses sympathy for the millions of victims of such policies, and urges the President to 1. Proclaim a day for mournful commemoration of the Great Famine in the Ukraine during the year 1933, which constituted a deliberate and imperialistic policy of Moscow to destroy the intellectual elite and large segments of the population of the Ukraine, and thus enhance its totalitarian communist rule over the conquered Ukrainian nation. 2. Urge the government of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics to remove current restrictions on the shipment of food parcels and other necessities to residents of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics by private individuals and charitable organizations. 3. Issue a warning that continued subjugation of the Ukrainian nation, as well as other non-Russian nations within the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, constitutes a threat to world peace and normal relationships among the peoples of Europe and the world at large. And concurrent resolutions, October 5, 1984. 4. Manifest to the peoples of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics through an appropriate and official means the historic fact that the people of the United States share with them their aspirations to determine their own destiny and recover their freedom.
The British government under Prime Minister Ramsay MacDonald of the Labour Party also chose to do or say nothing about the famine, despite plentiful information coming in from diplomats, journalists, and other professionals.
One of these professionals was Canadian agronomist Andrew Cairns, who traveled through Ukraine and the Northern Caucasus on behalf of the Empire Marketing Board in 1932. And in May of that year, he wrote a letter to the British ambassador in Moscow saying,
"Like yourself, I have heard many stories about the serious food shortage in the rural districts. My friend, who is well informed on Russian conditions, just laughs when I ask him how present-day living conditions compare with pre-war and NEP times, and says there is no comparison. The day clerk at the Grand Hotel tells me that the collective farms around his home in the Ukraine have absolutely nothing, and that there is a great deal of trouble there."
Another British diplomat had this to say about the first 5-year plan in 1932.
The 5-year plan proceeds on paper on its brilliant course, but viewed in cold light of reason, its achievements become less dazzling. Even the Soviet leaders have expressed themselves as dissatisfied with the results of 1931. The industrial development of the country is more theoretical than real. The great factories and works which have been erected have, for the most part, hitherto failed to justify their enormous cost, both in money, moral, and health. The country is over-organized, and the machinery of the state apparatus clogged with bureaucracy, fear of responsibility, theory, and mismanagement.
William String reported on the lack of food to the Foreign Office in August of 1932. Around the same time, Stalin implemented his law on socialist property, which made stealing of grain a capital offense, punishable by death.
The Soviet press nowadays makes little serious attempt to disguise the fact that the more or less successful strivings to create a new polity, which are the sum and substance of the so-called plan, are accompanied and conditioned by a desperate struggle on the part of society for bare subsistence, which forms no part of the plan and which is still believed the plan will one day resolve. Andrew Cairns wrote another report describing the desolation of the landscape as well as the lack of food that same month.
All morning and forenoon, I saw the usual sight out of the train window: much fine land, idle, and growing only a magnificent crop of weeds. Uncut crops, full of weeds, and from the appearance of the stubble and stalks, the cut crops had apparently been full of weeds too. Voronezh, the capital of the central Black Earth area, looks even worse than many towns of similar size I have been in. The buildings and streets are all in a frightful state of dilapidation. To my surprise, there was very little bread for sale. The people in the streets looked even poorer than they usually do in most towns of similar size, and the number of rag-clad, pot-bellied children seemed to be as high, if not higher, than usual.
Walter Durrante, who had been covering up the famine on behalf of the Soviets, spoke with William Strang in October of 1932 about the devastation of it, before Gareth Jones reported on it. Mr. Durrante came today to exchange views. He has at last awakened to the agricultural situation. He says that the true position is only just being realized. His description of conditions was not very different from what we have ourselves been reporting for the last 6 to 9 months. There has been a constant drain of population from the countryside since about 1929, due to a movement of peasants from country to town, in search of better living conditions. It is a bitter experience for country workers to find their good produce dispatched they know not where, and to be left with not even enough food to feed themselves. Large areas are almost depopulated and are going out of cultivation. In addition to all of this, the deportation of the kulaks has swept the countryside of the most enterprising, skilled, and industrious part of its population.
The ambassador who succeeded Strang, Sir Edmund Ove, reported to the British Foreign Office stories of food being taken from the homes of Ukrainians.
A former British subject, now married to a Soviet citizen, stated recently in a letter regarding her desire to return to England that she had lately bought some flour on the open market, but the representatives of the local agricultural authorities had entered the house and confiscated it without explanation. Another case, the holder of a British passport, who bought several pounds of flour, butter, sausage, and the open market, for which she must have paid some hundreds of rubles at current prices. On her way home with her purchases, she was accosted by a party of men, describing themselves as representatives of a local village Soviet, who confiscated her property. In none of these cases do the persons concerned appear to have sought a remedy in the Soviet courts, but I hesitate to recommend them to do so. The French government was probably the least informed of the famine in all of Europe. Most of their information came either directly through Soviet propaganda or through their embassies outside of the Soviet Union. French journalists in Moscow didn't venture outside the city like their British and American counterparts. It also didn't help that France sent a former socialist prime minister, Édouard Herriot, as an ambassador to the Soviet Union. His Soviet handlers took him around several Potemkin villages, filled with well-fed people from the cities in order to disguise the famine. This tactic was already well known in diplomatic and journalistic circles, but Herriot absorbed the propaganda without the slightest critique. He later published a book denying the famine in 1933, The East, where it savagely denies the reality of a famine in 1932 to 1933 in Ukraine. The Italians, in contrast, were far better informed about the goings-on in Ukraine. Unlike the French, British, or Americans, Italy had diplomatic consulates in Ukraine during the famine, and the Italian diplomats reported the devastation of the famine back to Rome. No bread of any kind is being sold on the open market anymore, not even the crust of bread. The lines of people waiting for bread distribution have grown interminable. You can see people standing for over 300 to 400 meters all along the sidewalk of a road, and you can find the store around the block of a parallel street. Beggars in the streets aren't interested in money anymore, as they can't get bread with the money, and it's bread they really want. The consul in Kharkiv reported this shortly before Stalin banned Ukrainians from traveling outside of Ukraine. Misery has generated real forms of banditry in Kharkiv and the surrounding area. Village newspapers reports of 7 cases of infanticide resulting from the famine. It appears that we are undoubtedly dealing with cannibalism. It is not uncommon in the mornings to find at the marketplace the nude corpses of those murdered during the night. Some are exposed for many days along Kharkiv's frozen riverbed. More savage still is the way in which these outlaws treat children. More than 300 have disappeared in Kharkiv during the last 6 weeks. This number has been confirmed by numerous sources, and there is no doubt about its validity. This tragic form of delinquency has diffused throughout Ukraine. In the courtyard next to the consulate, a child from a nearby village was found dead 2 weeks ago, nude and strangled. Shortly after Gareth Jones' trip to Ukraine, the Italian diplomats reported this. Riots recently occurred in Kharkiv in front of bakeries. In one of them, the suburbs, 3,500 people attacked the policemen who were trying to disperse them. In another suburb, 2 bakeries were attacked. Flour was taken and the premises destroyed before police could intervene. To prevent recurrence of such incidents, the police have resorted to the practice of mass arrests. One morning at 4 o'clock, the police suddenly blocked off the side street exits and surrounded a mass of 1,500 people gathered in front of a bakery waiting for it to open, truncheoned them to one of the courtyards at the nearby police station. When they were sent off to the station, loaded onto trains and driven back out towards the countryside. It is not uncommon for passengers who have died of starvation to be unloaded from their trains at stations. With the thaw, unburied bodies have been found out in the countryside. In the villages, whole families have withdrawn into their homes and are dying of inanition. Rumors are circulating of numerous cases of cannibalism. There were attempted international relief efforts, the most important of which was led by Cardinal Theodor Innitzer of Vienna. He orchestrated an interfaith coalition of Catholics, Protestants, Orthodox, and Jews to procure and distribute food to the inflicted parts of the Soviet Union, just as Herbert Hoover had done back in 1921. But unlike Lenin, Stalin wasn't willing to let any international relief effort come in. Doing so would not just be acknowledgement of the 5-year plan's failure, but he feared that it would secretly be funding an armed uprising of Ukrainians against Moscow. Innitzer wanted to do more, but the sitting Pope, Pius XI, wanted to avoid getting the church entangled with politics, which would violate the agreement made between the Vatican and Mussolini. He also feared that openly condemning what the Soviet Union was doing would lead to world leaders accusing the Catholic Church of supporting the Nazis and fascists, so he remained silent. The Germans also had consuls in Ukraine, and so were privy to what the Italians saw as well.
The communist rulers do not let the peasants remember their hardships for too long, achieving this by having one hardship follow the other immediately, and thus, whether one wants to or not, the old fears are forgotten. In the past, if someone in a village was struck by misfortune, entire generations were remembered.
Prior to Hitler's ascension to power, the German diplomatic missions in the Soviet Union felt strongly about the famine in Ukraine. The German consul in Kiev saw a Soviet newspaper claim that there was a famine going on in Germany. In response, the consul's wife goes out to the countryside and takes photos of corpses along the roads. Meanwhile, in the Moscow embassy, younger German workers petition their government to cut ties with the Soviet Union, but the government refuses, not wanting to shut off trade during a depression. The German diplomat in Moscow and future advisor on Soviet policy to the CIA, Gustav Hilger, stated this about the famine.
It was our impression that the authorities deliberately refrained from aiding the stricken population, except those organized in collective farms, in order to demonstrate to the recalcitrant peasant that death by starvation was the only alternative to collectivization.
The German government was acutely aware of the goings-on in the Soviet Union, especially because a sizable number of Germans lived in the Volga region, which was also hit by the famine. The Volga Germans sent letters to their relatives in Germany and the US, some of them being published in newspapers. Hitler would speak about the plight of the famine among the Volga Germans, but not of the Ukrainians. But for the most part, Hitler's government was silent on the famine, not wanting to antagonize the Soviets too soon. The Nazis would later publish a collection of eyewitness testimonies from Volga Germans titled, "And So You See the Soviets in a True Light." These testimonies themselves were accurate, but the commentaries around them were Nazi propaganda, which blamed the Jews more than the communists for the actual famine. But the story of the famine does not end here. For the quest for utopia brings yet more sorrow. To paraphrase an idiom popularized by Karl Marx, first it came as tragedy, then later as farce. After several years of antagonism, the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany signed a non-aggression pact, in which they divided Eastern Europe between the two of them, and promised to stay out of each other's way. And they would celebrate this by dividing up Poland. Poland was on edge and anticipating an attack from Germany, and when it came on September 1st, 1939, the continent quickly submerged into war. Britain and France, keeping up their public vibrato, declared war on Germany on September 3rd. The Soviets expected the Poles to hold up better than they had, but the speed of German advances forced them to declare war on September 17th. They annexed the territories of eastern Poland, and in a gift to the Ukraine, they merged the Ukrainian portions of eastern Poland with the Ukrainian SSR. In November, the Soviets invaded Finland and annexed northern Bukovina and southern Bessarabia, also adding them to the Ukrainian SSR. And in June of 1940, they invaded and occupied the Baltic states. The annexations and occupations resulted in violent deportation of class enemies, and replaced all private industry with Soviet commissars. But the Soviets wouldn't have long to enjoy their ill-gotten gains. On Sunday, June 22, 1941, Nazi Germany declared war by invading the Soviet Union. Stalin was initially unresponsive to the attack, but he did start making plans to resist the invasion. On June 27th, he issued his secret Scorched Earth Order.
All valuable materials, energy and agricultural stocks, and standing grain that cannot be taken away and can be used by the enemy must, in order to prevent such use, upon order of the military councils of the fronts, be immediately made completely worthless, that is, must be destroyed, annihilated, and burned.
Along with this, he ordered the creation of sabotage groups to stay behind, wreck farm equipment, and harass the Germans. The orders were only supposed to be applied to regions near the front, but some local Communist Party leaders away from the front began destroying their own crops and farm equipment out of fear of waiting too long. Along with the destruction of socialist property, NKGB agents were sent to prisons along the front, which were holding mostly political prisoners, and had them killed. In some towns and villages, the executions were interrupted by locals coming in to warn the agents that Germans were on the outskirts of towns, causing them to flee before finishing the task. But oftentimes, the Germans were still, in reality, miles away. In Ukraine, some local parties encouraged the dismantling of the collective farms and the return of tools, land, and livestock to their previous owners. Sometimes the collective farm workers would do this spontaneously on their own after hearing about another village nearby doing so, and often against the will of the local party. The Germans would often come across a perfectly intact wheat field, but the tractors were missing parts. The only places in Ukraine and across much of the Eastern Front that fully implemented the Scorched Earth Order was along the main roads the Red Army was retreating on. As the Nazis invaded the USSR, numerous peoples treated them as liberators, such as the peoples of the Baltic states and especially the Ukrainians. Entire units of Ukrainian soldiers deserted the Red Army in support of the Germans. There were some within the Nazi government who believed the entirety of Soviet society could have been turned against Stalin, such as Hans Koch, an intelligence officer on the Eastern Front. The vast majority of the population of the Ukraine has turned out to be anti-Bolshevik. Almost all of them consider their political future to be on the side of the Axis powers, and first of all the Greater German Reich. In countless gatherings, people speak spontaneously of Adolf Hitler, our greatest leader and liberator. Mothers instruct their children to address the German soldiers as uncle. Every day, peasant men and women lay fresh flowers on the graves of German soldiers on their own initiative. This feeling was especially true of veterans from the First World War, and others old enough to remember the German occupation and how they defended them from the early Bolshevik attacks under Lenin. The Germans announced the creation of a new Ukrainian state, which brought many Ukrainians to their side at first. Some formed their own military units in support of the Nazi occupiers. The Nazis would airdrop leaflets over territories they were about to occupy, announcing the changes they were going to make. Some locals engaged in looting as the Germans arrived or as the Red Army left, all the while the NKVD burned government records. A majority of Ukraine was occupied by November of 1941, and over 500,000 Red Army soldiers had been captured. Hungarian and Romanian troops serving in occupied Ukraine had a habit of stealing from the local populace, with the Germans participating at a lower scale. Most civilian deaths at the beginning were from soldiers suspecting the local was a partisan or saboteur, but as the war went on, especially behind the front lines, most of them were done out of convenience.
Now, I'm sure some of you are wondering, how could the Ukrainians collaborate with the Nazis? I mean, after all, they're Nazis. But take this into account. None of this was new to the Ukrainians. 2 years earlier, the Soviets had collaborated with the Nazis in order to invade sovereign countries. And everything the Nazis were doing to the Ukrainians had already been done to them by the Soviets, and in some cases worse by the Soviets. So, from the perspective of someone who's already been through hell, what's the harm in taking another trip? After all, you have nothing to lose but your chains.
Almost all of the peasants supported without hesitation what they assumed was a war only on Stalin and his regime.
In the Soviet Union, we found on our arrival a population weary of Bolshevism, which waited longingly for new slogans, holding out the prospect of a better future for them. It was Germany's duty to find such slogans, but they remained unuttered. The population greeted us with joy as liberators and placed themselves at our disposal.
The Germans had plans for Eastern Europe. Russian Poland would become a German protectorate called Ostland. Ukraine would become an independent state in alliance with Germany. The Baltics and Belarus would become protectorates until they could be annexed. And Caucasia would become a German plenipotentiary. But most of these states weren't supposed to be populated by its native inhabitants. They were supposed to be replaced by ethnic Germans moving in, all the while working the local inhabitants to death. After all, these people were Slavs, just one rung above Jews in their eyes. Hitler and the Nazis wanted Ukraine for the same reason the Soviets did, and they had a plan. Herbert Beck was a Nazi official in charge of food and agriculture, and he developed the Hunger Plan, which was to work the Slavs of Eastern Europe to death out in the grain fields, so they could feed the Nazi war machine. There was enough food around to potentially save thousands of Russian prisoners of war, and it was a racist ethos, not economic constraints or other circumstances, that enabled their captors to embark on their deliberate starvation.
The job of feeding the German people stands at the top of the list of Germany's claims on the East. The southern territories will have to serve for feeding of the German people. We see absolutely no reason for any obligation on our part to feed also the Russian people with the products of that surplus territory. We know that this is a harsh necessity bare of any feelings, and the future will hold very hard years in store for the Russians. The German administration in these territories may well attempt to mitigate the consequences of the famine, which undoubtedly will take place, and to accelerate the return to primitive agricultural conditions. However, these measures will not avert famine. Any attempt to save the population there from death by starvation by importing surpluses from the black soil zone would be at the expense of supplies to Europe. It would reduce Germany's staying power in the war and would undermine Germany and Europe's power to resist the blockade. This just be clearly and absolutely understood. The Slavs are to work for us. Insofar as we don't need them, they may die. Therefore, compulsory vaccination and German health services are superfluous. The fertility of the Slavs is undesirable. They may use contraceptives or practice abortion, the more the better. Education is dangerous. It is enough if they can count up to 100. Every educated person is a future enemy. Religion we leave to them as a means of diversion. As for food, they won't get any more than is absolutely necessary. We are the masters, and we come first.
Despite all the promises the Nazis made to the Ukrainians, none of them were kept. Most pressing of which being that around farm collectivization.
Many farms had been decollectivized during the invasion, but as the occupation began, the Germans not only banned further decollectivization, they recollectivized many farms as well. The Nazis wanted Ukraine and the rest of Eastern Europe for Lebensraum, and the big reason for Lebensraum was food. When farms are collectivized, it's a lot easier to appropriate the grain. They also followed the Soviet example by taking food from people's homes, so the Germans continued most of the same policies as the Soviets. The only difference being they allowed some churches to reopen, so long as the churches didn't foment any resistance. The Germans also waged a propaganda war in the Ukraine, trying to win their minds, all the while starving their bodies. They continued distributing leaflets telling the Ukrainians they would decollectivize the farms as soon as the communists were taken care of. They uncovered mass graves of victims killed by the Soviet secret police, which were plastered in newspapers to support Nazi propaganda. The biggest difference, though, was that people were allowed to talk about the famine in public for the first time. The first semi-academic articles about the famines were written by Ukrainian demographers during the Nazi occupation. Many of these articles had to go through Nazi approval, consisting of enough anti-Semitic propaganda, but the Ukrainians were desperate to read anything that hadn't gone through Stalin's censors. Public gatherings occurred where people shared their stories about the famine, with some people even confessing to cannibalism, but the crowds forgave them, knowing the hell that the communists had put them through. Eventually, the Nazis were driven out of Ukraine and the Soviet Union, and with that, any talk of the famine ceased. Many Ukrainians were executed or sent off to the gulags for having collaborated with the Nazis, and it was after the war that the Soviets developed their new propaganda techniques.
Before the war, opponents of the Soviet Union were referred to as reactionaries or as the follower of one or another defunct political factions from during the Civil War. But afterwards, everyone who opposed the Soviet Union in any way was referred to as a fascist, a Nazi, or a Hitlerite. This tactic was developed by Soviet propagandists, and it spread like wildfire across the political left around the world.
Also in the post-war years was the creation of international institutions such as the United Nations, which was tasked with dealing with the crimes of the Nazis, including the Holocaust, which was a seemingly unprecedented massacre of human life. During the war, a new word gained popularity: genocide, a combination of the Greek word genos, meaning race, and the Latin suffix side. The word was coined by a Polish-Jewish lawyer, Raphael Lemkin. He initially coined the word to describe the mass murder of Armenians in World War I, but as news of what the Germans were doing to Jews in camps across Europe became known, the usage of the word began to focus on the Holocaust. He originally defined genocide in his book, Axis Rule, in 1944, which included trying to destroy groups based on nationality, ethnicity, culture, religion, and politics. This definition was problematic for the Soviets. The famine against the Ukrainians wasn't because of their nationality, ethnicity, or culture. Stalin didn't particularly care that the Ukrainians spoke their own language. He only cared when what was being spoken in that language was politically against his interests.
The Holodomor was a genocide against the Ukrainian national movement, against anyone who wanted some kind of political independence for the Ukrainians. It wasn't intended to wipe out the Ukrainian ethnicity or nationality, but rather to eliminate a political threat. Because if the Ukrainians were allowed to leave the Soviet Union, who else might try next? According to Lemkin's definition, the Holodomor was in fact a genocide. But you don't have to take my word for it. Lemkin said so himself. In a speech he gave in New York in 1953, he described the famine as
perhaps the classic example of Soviet genocide, its longest and broadest experiments in Russification, the destruction of the Ukrainian nation. A famine was necessary for the Soviets, and so they got one to order. This is not simply a case of mass murder. It is a case of genocide, of destruction.
Lemkin tried to get a treaty on the genocide passed in 1945, but it failed. He spent the next several years until the UN hosted its own convention on genocide in 1948. An early draft of the treaty condemned genocide on religious, racial, political, and any other ground. But the Soviets resisted the inclusion of political groups. The Soviet representatives said,
"They were entirely out of place in a scientific definition of genocide, and their inclusion would weaken the convention and hinder the fight against genocide."
This played into the Soviets' new post-war propaganda plans. They wanted the idea of genocide to be an exclusive sin of fascists and Nazis. In order to get the Soviets to sign up on the treaty, the reference to political groups was removed, and done so with the approval of Raphael Lemkin. Had the concept of genocide remained simply an idea in the minds and writings of scholars, there would be no argument today. According to Lemkin's definition, the Holodomor was a genocide, as it is by most intuitive understandings of the word, but the concept of genocide became part of international law in a completely different context, that of the Nuremberg trials and the legal debates which followed.
At this point now, the Ukrainians have had farce heaped upon tragedy, heaped upon farce upon more tragedy. But now, from this point, their lowest point, they will finally begin to claw their way out of the darkness and finally get the world to see the crimes committed against them by the workers' paradise, regardless of your own political narrative. In the previous sections, we saw that there was plenty of evidence between journalists, ambassadors, and eyewitness testimonies to support the veracity of the stories around the famine. But it was ignored by academics for decades. Why was this? Well, one big part of it has to do with the foundations for the study of Russian history and the Bolsheviks.
In the English-speaking world, the academic study of Russian history was founded by émigré Russian scholars. Its practitioners tended to internalize the prejudices of pre-revolutionary Russian opinion, which generally held that Ukrainians were not to be taken seriously or that they were separatists and traitors from the Russian motherland. Despite a clear link in Soviet ideology under Lenin and Stalin between what was called the nationality question and the peasant question, Western scholarship has persisted in treating each separately. The main intellectual reservoirs from which Soviet history flows are Russian history and Soviet politics. Both developed a strong Russocentric bias. The biggest difficulty early on was getting Soviet scholars to admit that there were problems with the collectivization under the 5-year plans, much less that some of these problems were intended towards genocide, and this was especially the case under Stalin. Even some defectors weren't willing to place the genocide accusation against Stalin, such as Viktor Kravchenko, a Ukrainian who defected to the US during the war. He wrote a memoir, I Chose Freedom, in 1946, with Eugene Lyons, one of the American journalists who helped cover up the Holodomor. In it, he describes the pitfalls of collectivization, but he doesn't go so far as to claim it was a deliberate policy. The mark was missed again in 1948 with a booklet published by V.S. Mertzalov, who portrayed the famine as a Russian tragedy rather than a Ukrainian one. In 1949, we see a Russo-American economist, Naum Jasny, write about farm collectivization in The Socialized Agriculture of the USSR, Plans and Performance, which angered many of his contemporaries who usually praised collectivization. He refers to the famine, but stops short of blaming it on deliberate policy. However, he does give a death toll estimate of 3.5 million, which is fairly close to the academic consensus today of between 3 and 4 million. Another reason the famine was largely ignored has to do with how the eyewitness testimonials sounded a little too polemic for the taste of professional historians in the West. Non-Soviet Ukrainians who dedicate themselves to the history of their nation tend to be motivated, above all, by a deep love of their people, culture, and national past. Occasionally, national pride has stood in the way of an objective portrayal, but this is hardly a characteristic unique to any single people. Still, the very fact that the bias operating in some Ukrainian historiography is so very different from that of Sovietology makes it all the more valuable in a field where objectivity is the ultimate end. We see examples of this popping up in the 1950s, with the Black Deeds of the Kremlin published in 1953 and the Ninth Circle published in 1954 by Ukrainian groups. But even these didn't claim that the famine was intentional, but rather pointed out that once Stalin knew the results of the policies, he did not reverse them. The authorities and their local representatives knew that when they took food away from the peasants, they were condemning them to death by starvation. Towards the end of 1932, it was no longer a secret that there were many cases of death by starvation, but the collection of food would proceed regardless. The demands of the Ukrainian peasants that after a complete or partial fulfillment of quotas, they should be permitted to keep some part in order to survive, were deemed to be the opposition class enemies of the government's task. Despite these being the biggest collections of eyewitness testimonies, scholars in both the Soviet Union and in the West ignored them. But like the Ninth Circle, the newspaper articles in Canada and the leaflets in Germany, it was studiously ignored by most Soviet scholars and mainstream journals. The mix of emotive peasant memoir with semi-scholarly essays did not appeal to professional American historians. Paradoxically, the Cold War did not help the Ukrainian émigré cause either. The language they were using, black deeds or famine as a political weapon, sounded too political to many scholars in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. The authors were easily dismissed as cold warriors telling tales. We would see cracks begin to form in the biases of American scholars with Clarence Manning's Ukraine Under the Soviets in 1953, which unfortunately lacked footnotes. But unlike his previous works mentioning the famine, he got the dates right. In Europe, the Munich Institute in Germany published works that talked about the famine, such as Dmytro Solovey's Golgotha of Ukraine. Solovey was a Ukrainian expat who fled during the war. His work was notable among Ukrainian émigrés because he mostly cited non-Ukrainian sources, and blamed Soviet national policy for the famine. He estimated a death toll of about 4.8 million deaths, which is even closer to the modern consensus than Naum Jasny. The Munich Institute would also publish a book in 1958 by Fedor Biloff, which went so far as to claim that the famine was intentional.
The famine of 1932 to 33 was not an isolated phenomenon, separate from the general policy of the occupying power in Ukraine. The famine of 1933 was only one stage in the struggle which Bolshevism carried out against the Ukrainian peasantry, the nationally conscious part of Ukrainian workers. In the Kremlin palaces was created the plan for the greatest terrorist act in the history of humanity. The plan to organize a massive, artificial famine throughout the entire Ukrainian SSR and in the Kuban, territories populated by Ukrainians.
Another Ukrainian defector, Fedor Biloff, was a former chairman of a collective farm, who was conscripted into the Red Army as a punishment for his farm not fulfilling its quota. In his 1955 memoir, The History of a Soviet Collective Farm, he not only recounts stories of the Soviets requisitioning grain and stealing food from homes, but also of peasant resistance.
In the search for surpluses, everything was collected. The farms were cleaned out even more thoroughly than the kulaks had been. As a result, famine, which was to become intense by the spring of 1933, already began to be felt in the fall of 1932. The famine of 1932-1933 was the most terrible and destructive that the Ukrainian people have ever experienced. The people died like wild beasts, ready to devour one another. No matter what they did, they went on dying. To protect what little grain they had from the raids of the militia, the peasants often banded together in groups of 30 or 40 persons and defended their gleanings with sticks and knives. These terrible scenes of starvation will be forgotten by none who saw them.
It was only after the death of Stalin that we begin to see acknowledgement of the famine slip through the censors. On occasion, Soviet historians would publish collections of government documents, and on the rare occasion they mentioned food troubles going on in the 1930s. It wasn't until the late 1950s and early 1960s that you see the first open acknowledgments that there had been any difficulties in the process of collectivizing the farms. In 1958, a textbook was published that discussed the shortcomings of the collectivization policies of Stalin.
In addition to this, in Ukraine, serious distortions in carrying out the grain procurements were observed. Collective farms which were able to fulfill the procurements plan were given supplementary plans in order to make up for the shortcomings of other collective farms. All this could not help but affect the level of the harvest. The 1932 sowing plan for grain crops was not met in 1932, which resulted in the creation of considerable food supply difficulties.
A surprising piece came from a Soviet history textbook from 1960 titled A History of the Ukrainian SSR, A Popular Outline. The first edition was published in Ukrainian and of course didn't mention the famine at all. But surprisingly enough, the second edition, which was published in Russian in 1965, did.
The harmful effects of errors, which had been permitted during collective farm construction, manifested themselves particularly acutely in the incorrect way in which the grain procurements were carried out. The grain procurements plans were frequently altered such that they were increased. The best collective farms, after fulfilling their assigned grain procurements plan, were given supplementary tasks. The Leninist principle of the collective farmer's material interest, zainteresovanost, in the results of his labor was ignored. All this led to the fact that in Ukraine, in the spring of 1933, acute food supply difficulties arose.
But old habits die hard. One Soviet scholar, V.V. Bondarenko, published an article in 1957 that blamed the food shortages on poor leadership from the local parties. Or in 1965 when M.T. Kutz described the famine as an acuteness, and blamed said acuteness on unfavorable meteorological conditions, which is a line that many deniers still hold today. When trying to explain the disparity in Ukrainian population numbers compared to others impacted by the famine, Soviet historians argued that it was because some Ukrainians started identifying themselves as Russian instead. Of course, all Soviet historiography is subject to the dictates of party-mindedness, especially when dealing with the Soviet period. Those who control the Soviet present also control the official past, and the Soviet Clio is ever the servant of politics. When exposing Stalinist excesses was the official watchword, there were times when the excesses were allowed to include not only the violence committed against members of the elite, but also against broader segments of society. But this was always the exception. There was still trouble in getting academics in the West to acknowledge the historicity of the famine. In 1958, the Institute for the Study of the USSR in Munich published numerous articles that talk about collectivization, but don't mention the famine in Ukraine. There was also a lack of curiosity among Americans who cover Soviet agricultural policy, such as the works of Roy Laird and Merrill Feinsod. And even worse, there were those who, although downplaying or denying the famine, also sought to apologize for Stalin, such as Theodor von Lau. Von Lau attempted to place Stalin's terror into a context in which overweening ambition and vast human sacrifice for political ends have been accepted as legitimate policy. He argued that a full consideration of the factors that produced Stalinism would allow us to dismiss it as an ominous symptom of an age, and that doing so may help to change the attitudes and even policies. In von Lau's view, any expression of moral repugnance at what Stalin was forced to do because of circumstances becomes a sort of Western moral imperialism, an attempt to impose Western moral values upon a society where they were inappropriate. Von Lau, it seems, sought both to explain and excuse Stalin. His latest approach has found little echo in the field. Despite all of this, the 1960s was the best time to talk about the famine in the Soviet Union until the perestroika under Mikhail Gorbachev. The mid-60s constituted the high point of Soviet historiography about the famine, euphemistically called the difficulties of 1932 to 33. Even then, the majority of Soviet historians took the politically safe route of mentioning distortions and abuses only in connection with the initial wave of collectivization. With the fall of Khrushchev, it gradually became less fashionable to write about the excesses committed by the man who had led the CPSU for a quarter of a century. In 1964, the British historian Dana Dalrymple published one of the first articles that describes the cover-up of the famine by the Soviets, and the role of foreign journalists played, such as Malcolm Muggeridge and Eugene Lyons. The disruptions growing out of collectivization led to the famine and to the death of millions of peasants. Obviously, this is not a point that the Soviet leaders would wish to emphasize. And in fact, they did such a good job of suppressing knowledge of it that few today know the famine, and even some otherwise well-informed students of the Soviet Union suggest that the famine was of little consequence.
Dalrymple is credited by many scholars for bringing the famine out of obscurity. 4 years later, Roman Serbin wrote an article based on documents published by the Foreign Office, parliamentary debates, as well as newspaper articles from the time period. And in that article, he revealed that people knew about the famine at the time and that it was artificial. And in 1968, Robert Conquest published The Great Terror, which dedicated several pages to the famine.
Even though Soviet scholars had neither the freedom nor the inclination to say that Stalin deliberately starved the Ukrainians to death, the 60s had been a good period for Soviet historiography. But everything changed in 1969 after Soviet Premier Leonid Brezhnev's speech to the All-Union Congress of Collective Farmers. In the process of collective farm construction, we were not free from known errors, but these were the errors of feeling our way, errors caused by lack of experience. The party itself uncovered these errors, spoke openly about them to the people, and corrected them. Unfortunately, to this day, one can find those who love to play up the costs of this great revolutionary event. In their view of the collective farm system, the Communist Party and the Soviet people are one. The collective farm system is our great historical achievement. The Institute of Marxism-Leninism published a piece shortly before Brezhnev's speech, in which the old Stalinist talking points about the famine were revived, and these talking points would begin to assert themselves in the works of Soviet scholars. One cannot but be amazed at the fact that some authors present the issue as though the errors and excesses of the collective farm movement, in essence, are only now being made known, as if these authors are the only ones capable of revealing what really took place. But this contradicts reality and is inconsistent with scholarly truth. Such authors are usually silent about the fact that the errors were immediately revealed and with all possible resoluteness thoroughly criticized by the party itself and by its central committee. Such an approach in illuminating the most important questions in the history of collectivization has principled and methodological significance. But just as the Soviets began to close themselves back off from the truth of the famine, the dams were beginning to crack in the West. In 1974, Moshe Lewin, a Polish Jew whose parents died in the Holocaust, published an article talking about the culture around Stalin's grain policies.
Officials understood well the meanings of the calls addressed to them to engage in a truly Bolshevik struggle for grain, to carry blows against the squandering of grain, and finally, to get the grain at any price. Another of those vague directives with a clear meaning, but still easily disowned by the leadership when necessary.
One Western historian who continued to protect the Soviet Union was E.H. Carr, a British diplomat who wrote a 14-volume history of Soviet Russia, published between 1950 and 1978. He was very Marxist in his approach, emphasizing an inevitability of what he deemed the historical process. He and many other Sovietologists focused their work on the idealism of people carrying out Stalin's policies rather than their impact. One of Carr's collaboration, R.W. Davies, said this of historians like Carr. The historian sympathetic to industrialization is almost tempted, as he turns these yellowing pages, to forget elementary economics and common sense, and identify himself for the moment with these inexperienced urban enthusiasts in those grim January days of 1930, boldly dreaming about rapid progress towards giant mechanized factory farms, cajoling reluctant peasants into the kolkhozy, denouncing recalcitrants and driving them out of the villages into the endless snow. The dams holding back the floodwaters of the Holodomor began to crack in the 1960s, and throughout the 1970s they continued to grow, despite the efforts of both Soviet scholars, as well as progressive and Marxist scholars in the West, to stem the tide. But the late 1970s saw the swelling of a conservative shift in politics. Between the election of Margaret Thatcher in the United Kingdom, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, and the election of Ronald Reagan in 1980, decades of repressed history would finally be brought to light.
Although the dam broke at the turn of the decade, we have to go back to 1970 to fully understand how it happened.
Since the 1930s, Ukrainian expat communities, especially in the US and Canada, tried to raise awareness of the famine, but journalists, academics, and politicians rejected it as right-wing propaganda. But over time, more and more people in those classes, and eventually outside those circles, began to recognize and acknowledge that it happened. And it only did so because Ukrainian communities kept talking about and kept the story alive outside the Soviet Union. As they became more socially established and economically prosperous, they were able to fund their own publications and institutions to research and publish materials on the famine. Back in the Soviet Union, Ukrainian intellectuals had tried reviving Ukrainian cultural identity in the 50s and 60s, but they were always repressed by Moscow. But by the 1970s, Ukrainian dissidents learned how to contact the BBC and Radio Liberty. 1970 saw the establishment of the Harvard Series in Ukrainian Studies, which republished older materials about Ukrainian history. This was followed by the establishment of the Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute in 1973, which focused on new original scholarship around Ukrainian history. At last, the process of disentangling Ukrainian history from that of Russia had begun in American academia. In 1980, a Polish academic teaching at the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies in Alberta published an article in the Journal of Ukrainian Studies, Collectivization in Light of Soviet Historiography. In this article, he emphasized the need for Western scholars of Ukrainian history and of the famine to look at the Soviet historiography, because it provided missing details that brought to life truths that the Soviets never could, nor ever would, admit to. In the 1980s, however, Western research made it impossible for the Soviets to ignore the famine. It was first revived in the consciousness of Soviet diplomats. Soviet representatives in the West, who periodically were confronted with the issue, felt obliged to answer questions raised by Western scholars. On April 28, 1983, the Soviet embassy in Canada issued a press release on the so-called famine in Ukraine, which had denied that there had been a famine, but only difficulties, mainly because of drought. Despite the fact that the majority of Ukrainian peasants had enthusiastically supported collectivization, the embassy claimed wealthy peasants, called kulaks, had opposed it, and committed acts of terrorism and sabotage. Of course, many families were badly affected. Some did suffer, especially those whose villages or sons were murdered by kulak bandits. Some villages felt a terrible strain after their grain reserves were burned, or cattle poisoned. Nevertheless, the whole picture in the Ukraine was not that of a nearly complete collapse with a smell of a nationwide tragedy, as it is portrayed by the most zealous of anti-Soviet writers in the media in Canada. On the contrary, the atmosphere of vigorous work and unparalleled enthusiasm prevailed as the nation embarked on the great economic and social programs. Whenever the famine was brought up at the UN, Soviet representatives would clarify it as alleged famine, and then accuse those who talked about it as spreading Nazi propaganda. Soviet academics began moving hard into the denialist direction in the 1980s, as Cold War tensions rose. One article, titled "Contrary to the Facts Concerning the Fabrications of Bourgeois Propaganda About Agriculture in the USSR," accused Western scholars of falsifying facts and using the memoirs of traitors and fascists to back up their anti-Soviet propaganda. Despite Soviet efforts, however, the floodwaters kept pouring. The first international conference on the famine was held in Montreal in 1983, in which scholars presented some demographic research. A Russian defector, Alexander Babyonishev, brings up that if you exclude the Russian settlers that Stalin sent to eastern Ukraine after the famine from the population of Ukraine, that means at least 4.5 million Ukrainians have died in the famine, which was the most conservative estimate up to that point. That conference inspired the creation of the International Commission of Inquiry into the 1932-33 famine in Ukraine in 1948. Numerous persons within the Canadian government would be consulted on how to conduct the commission, including John Supinka, a Ukrainian justice on the Supreme Court of Canada. However, since this commission was a privately managed endeavor, it would take longer for it to get moving. As more of the world began rallying around the Ukrainian cause, Soviet institutions upped their propaganda game to counter the truth about the Holodomor and reinforce the Stalinist line. One such institution was, and this is a mouthful, the Institute for Study of the History and Socio-Economic Problems of Foreign Countries of the Academy of Sciences of the Ukrainian SSR. Here's some quick context on that monster of a name.
The Soviet Union, following along with the idea of scientific socialism, tried to portray everything they did as being backed by facts and logic and science. Well, this results in basically them naming all of their universities as the Academy of Sciences, even if it has nothing to do with, STEM fields and whatnot. And the other part of the name basically is implying that their entire mission is, I'm rubber, you're glue, and you're actually guilty of all the stuff you're accusing us of doing, but even worse.
In reactionary historiography, so little effort is made in giving battle to Soviet scholarship on the results of collectivization. A significant place here is held by speculations, in particular about the food supply difficulties which arose in a number of districts in Ukraine in 1932 to 1933. The real causes, lack of experience in organizing production in most of the collective farms, undermining activities and remnants of the Kaleks, drought in some districts, are all dropped from their calculations. If one talks about the premeditated actions intended to leave the toilers without food supplies, then such things really happened. Those who organized and made use of these activities were the remnants of the defeated exploiting classes, primarily former kulaks.
You also have Russian and Soviet scholars claiming that Soviet studies programs in the West were actually designed as tools for psychological warfare against the Soviet Union.
The policy of American imperialism in the 80s is characterized by new attempts to distort vulgarly the values of real socialism. The ruling circles of the USA and their ideological propaganda apparatus have recently intensified their attacks on the economic development of our country as a whole, and of our republic in particular, to discredit the agricultural situation in Ukraine. A new step in the escalation of the psychological war and the intensification of its interference in the internal affairs of the USSR is the provocative and hysterical campaign in Washington in connection with the food supply difficulties which took place in the 1930s in Ukraine. At this point, there are still Western scholars defending the moderate line of Soviet historiography from the 1960s, such as Australian scholar Stephen G. Wheatcroft, who in 1985 depicts the famine as nothing more than a problem of policy. While not dismissing the significance of peasant volition and the lack of material incentives, or the effect of the weather, I conclude that by 1932 it was the very critical shortage of traction power, particularly in Ukraine and the southern production region, that was of most significance. There were bound to be delays in carrying out the major harvesting, winter harvesting, and winter sowing campaigns upon which fate or arable production was highly dependent. The upcoming US Commission had this to say about Wheatcroft. Such a gross misstatement of the historical problem is analogous to studying the problem of theft from the standpoint of the thief who has trouble finding enough to steal. Another big blow was made in the West with the documentary Harvest of Despair, which aired on Canadian public TV in 1985. The documentary had interviews with people such as Malcolm Muggeridge, who had witnessed the famine and participated in the media cover-up. American television stations initially refused to air the documentary because it was too, and I quote, right-wing. It would eventually be aired as part of an episode of Firing Line with William F. Buckley, and would feature a debate between Buckley and Robert Conquest against Christopher Hitchens and Harrison Salisbury, another Soviet historian. The documentary caused such a stir that representatives of the Soviet government had to respond to it specifically. A former Soviet representative to the UN would do so in a 3-day radio broadcast in which he said, "The notorious thesis about the artificial famine in the Soviet Union is being used by the propaganda services in the USA in order to divert the attention of its own population from their own difficulties." It was not by chance that the start of the anti-Soviet campaign coincided with an acute exacerbation of the food situation in the USA itself. Attempts to speculate on historical events of 50 years ago to whip up anti-Soviet hysteria and encourage hatred for our country has turned out to be without prospects. But just as in the past, so now also, all this will gradually die down. Later that same year, the U.S. Congress set up its own commission, chaired by Florida Congressman Daniel A. Mica, to investigate the famine, the purpose of which was to conduct a study of the 1932-33 Ukrainian famine in order to expand the world's knowledge of the famine and provide the American public with a better understanding of the Soviet system by revealing the Soviet role. It would deliver its findings to Congress on April 22, 1988, which was a major source for these videos. The findings of the report concluded that millions of people starved to death in a man-made famine due to the Soviet seizure of crops, that there was no kulak sabotage, it was not related to any drought, that the inability to meet grain quotas in Ukraine resulted in harsher confiscatory policy, that Stalin knew people were starving to death by late 1932 at the latest, and that Joseph Stalin and those around him had committed genocide against the Ukrainians. It also found that the American government of the Hoover and Roosevelt administrations had ample and timely information about the famine, but chose to do nothing. And then the Roosevelt administration gave diplomatic recognition to the USSR, and that during the famine, certain members of the press corps actively cooperated with the Soviets in order to cover up that famine. In 1986, Robert Conquest published his book, Harvest of Sorrow, which he wrote with the assistance of the Harvard Institute of Ukrainian Studies. A pre-publication version of the book served as a blueprint for the Harvest of Despair documentary the year prior. Before its publication, representatives from the Ukraine SSR asked Harvard to not publish the book. In exchange for not publishing it, they were offered access to the Soviet archives, but Harvard refused. The reason for this was quite simple. Nobody trusted the Soviets. Would this be true access or just access to the materials approved of by Moscow? With that apprehension well understood, the deal did not go through. Many within Western academia denounced the book because Conquest was a conservative. UCLA professor John Getty criticized Harvard for working with Conquest due to his association with the American Enterprise Institute. We also see an odd about-face from Moshe Lewin, who a decade earlier published an article about how the culture around grain confiscation contributed to the famine, now claiming that Conquest's book was irresponsible to write, despite finding no false information.
This is crap, rubbish. I am an anti-Stalinist, but I don't see how this campaign adds to our knowledge. It's adding horrors until it becomes a pathology.
The U.S. Commission on the Famine commented on this dispute between Lewin and Conquest. As Robert Conquest has rightly pointed out, Lewin's position seems to be not that it didn't happen, but that I ought not to write about it. Odd for a scholar. Anne Applebaum, author of Red Famine, said this about these kinds of restrictions. The politics of Cold War academia meant that any scholars who wrote about Soviet atrocities were easily pigeonholed. There were also some positive reactions from fellow scholars of the Soviet Union. Just how much material has accumulated over the years, most of it perfectly accessible in British libraries. Almost unbelievably, Dr. Conquest's book is the first historical study of what must count as one of the greatest man-made horrors in a century full of them. The words of Harvest of Sorrow would make it to Ukrainian dissidents in the fall of 1986, being read aloud on Radio Liberty broadcasting to Behind the Iron Curtain. In 1987, we see the magnum opus of denialist literature that is cited by members of the far left today. Fraud, Famine, and Fascism: The Ukrainian Genocide Myth from Hitler to Harvard, by Canadian labor activist Douglas Tottle.
From the earliest days of the Russian Revolution to the present, propaganda campaigns have been conducted against the Soviet Union. Those in positions of power in capitalist countries see socialism as a threat to their continued profit and privilege, both to undermine support of a socialist alternative at home and to maintain a dominant position in international economic and political relationships. All manner of lies and distortions are employed to cast the USSR in as negative a light as possible.
In his book, he refers to all accounts of the famine as Nazi propaganda. He claims the story was broken by Nazi press, completely ignoring the fact that British journalists and Weimar journalists also broke the story before the Nazis ever talked about it. He also claimed that the fake famine story was widely published, but that wasn't true. The reach of the story was limited and written off by journalists, politicians, and academics because they thought it was just anti-communist propaganda, and most continued to think that even after the Holocaust was uncovered. And of course, he repeated the line of Soviet propagandists, that anybody who brought it up, or anything else negative about the Soviet Union, was a Nazi or fascist. He pushes the old Soviet line from the 60s, that what little food issue was there came from drought, inexperience, and kulak sabotage.
Throughout the famine genocide campaign, however, the factors of drought and sabotage have been ignored, denied, downplayed, or distorted.
He also engages in Stalinist apologetics.
The Soviets charted a course that had no precedence in world history, the building of a socialist society. They sought to transform a backward land plagued by poverty and illiteracy into an industrialized country with a modern agricultural sector. This was seen by the Soviets as necessary not only for economic and social development, but also for the very survival of socialism in a hostile international environment.
The International Commission to investigate the famine invited Douglas Tottle to be interviewed, but he declined. When they examined his book, they found it contained information that no normal person and very few academics would have had access to. This has led many to believe that Fraud, Famine, and Fascism was not written by Tottle. Some believe that it was actually written by Soviet propagandists for an American audience, and that it was given to Tottle via contacts in the Communist Party of Canada. Another explanation is that Tottle was reached out to write such a book, and the Soviets provided him with materials. Either way, Tottle's work seems completely dependent upon Soviet propaganda rather than any scholarship on the famine. In 1987, the Ukrainian Communist Party created its own committee to investigate the famine in order to counteract the American Commission. To do this, the party historians were given access to Soviet archives. They were expecting a perfectly reasonable explanation for what happened, but they didn't. Rather, what they found was more evidence of what was being said in the West. But not just that. They found the explicit orders of Joseph Stalin asking for more food and grain to be confiscated from Ukraine, knowing full well how bad the famine was in Ukraine. They discovered that Stalin knowingly made the famine worse, that the famine was not just man-made, but intentional. It was a genocide. Now, despite having this evidence, they couldn't just come out and declare it was a genocide. The party leaders and the historians would quickly find themselves disappeared if they did. This had happened to people over the decades even after Stalin's death. But this was also the era of perestroika, so they took a chance. The head of the Ukrainian Communist Party, Volodymyr Skrbitsky, in a speech commemorating the 70th anniversary of the October Revolution in 1987, officially stated that the famine did happen and that it was the fault of Stalin's grain procurement policies. He stopped short of labeling it as a genocide, but this was the highest level official within the Soviet Union to ever admit that the famine was real, and the fault of Soviet policy. The committee that was put together to research the famine ceased to function after the announcement, but Ukrainian historians continued searching through the archive for more information. They put together a collection of documents about the famine, and the Communist Party of the USSR approved it for publication in February of 1990. After the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991, the archives began to open up to the world, and at that point, it could no longer be kept secret. In the time since then, Ukrainian demographers have been able to do more research into the famine and discover its costs. Unfortunately, we will never know the exact death toll, but the Ukrainian demographers have estimated between 3 and 4 million died in Ukraine alone during the famine, based on birth and death records. Unfortunately, we can't fully account for the true number of deaths due to records being edited to hide starvation, and in some cases, death records being deliberately destroyed to hide the evidence. But at last, the ultimate truth of the famine is out.
After decades of being gaslighted by Soviets, journalists, politicians, and academics, they were finally being heard. No longer were their stories just right-wing propaganda, but verified facts. The suffering they endured was real, and the men responsible got away with it. The Ukrainians would win their battle for posterity. But unfortunately, despite all of this, the Holodomor is still impacting Ukraine today.
The Holodomor is still impacting Ukraine today. Firstly, there's the impact it has on the population size. In 1926, there were 23.2 million Ukrainians living in the Soviet Union. By 1939, there were only 23.6 million. In contrast, Russians went from 2.6 million to 4.1 million, almost a 50% increase. Taking the 3 to 4 million consensus view of Ukrainian deaths from the famine, that means that the Ukrainian population is approximately 12.5 and 17% smaller than it could have been, had there been no famine. It's not the 25% that many of the earliest documentaries and books claimed, but it's still bad. And with a smaller population also comes a smaller and weaker economy. The demographic issues don't end there. For those who are unaware, or don't remember, Since late 2013, Ukraine has been dealing with Russian interference in its internal affairs. Russia annexed the Crimean Peninsula, which at this point still only has limited international recognition, and Russia has also sponsored separatist groups in eastern Ukraine. These separatists are ethnic Russians, who have been living in eastern Ukraine since Joseph Stalin settled thousands of Russian families into lands that were depopulated thanks to the famine and collectivization. Basically, Stalin used Ukraine as a colony. Settle your own population there and extract the resources. Holodomor denial still exists in Russia today. Russian academics backtracking from their Stalinist position of the 1980s now admit that a famine happened. However, they reduce its important and potential death toll, limiting it to the low hundreds of thousands rather than the 3 to 4 million that is the scholarly consensus. In contrast, Russian politicians do not tend to agree with the academics. For years after the Orange Revolution, relations between Ukraine and Russia were cold, with the Holodomor being frequently and openly discussed by Ukrainian politicians. Relations temporarily warmed after the election of pro-Russian politician Viktor Yanukovych in 2010, during whose tenure discussions of the Holodomor was put on the back burner.
Outside the context of Russo-Ukrainian relations, Holodomor denial is largely a signature of the political far left. And I'm afraid it's right here where I'm going to have to get a little more explicitly political, because Holodomor denial is largely an exclusive problem of the left. In the world of genocide studies, comparing multiple genocides is something that's somewhat fraught. It's not taboo, but you have to be very careful when doing it.
In popular discussion around genocide, there is a tendency to simplify how genocides happen and claim that they all start and proceed the same way. But that's just not the case. Each genocide has its own historical context, and so you should be careful when talking about them in order to avoid gross generalities. However, I'm not interested in comparing the Holodomor to the Holocaust, but rather comparing the denial of one to the other. I've made a video about the history of Holocaust denial, which you can watch right here, but let's look at its origin. The Nazi regime didn't last long enough to try and hide the Holocaust from the rest of the world. This was hard to do because most of the victims of the Holocaust were from outside of Germany, and once your genocide has crossed an international border, it's a lot harder to cover up. In contrast, the Holodomor happened within the borders of the Soviet Union, which was a highly regimented society with little unfettered access to foreigners. Because of this, the Holocaust was known about right away, and governments were already active at war with Germany. In contrast, during the Holodomor, most countries in the world were trying to open up relations with the Soviet Union in order to boost trade, so these foreign governments were far more willing to look the other way when it came to atrocities. Because of these two backgrounds, Holocaust denial is more populist in its origins, while Holodomor denial began its life as the official stated truth of the Soviet Union. On top of this, Holodomor denial originated in the country in which it happened, while Holocaust denial originated in France. Both are similar in terms of their purpose. Holocaust denial is meant to exonerate Hitler and the Nazis by erasing the biggest blemish on its reputation. Holodomor denial is meant to exonerate the Soviet Union more generally, but more specifically to exonerate Stalin. One importance between the two is where we find the deniers. Holocaust denial is a bigger problem on the far right than it is on the far left. But there are, in fact, left-wing Holocaust deniers. Left-wing Holocaust deniers mostly exist in France, but apparently it's spreading outside of France according to some screenshots shared by hot tanky tanks on Twitter. The logic behind left-wing Holocaust denial is that capitalists will fabricate genocide stories in order to make communism look bad or to distract people from the horrors of capitalism, by tricking you into thinking that there's something worse. On the other hand, you don't really have right-wing Holodomor deniers, or at least you don't have any outside of Russia. In post-Soviet Russia, both the nationalists and the communists deny the Holodomor. And this is because both factions emerged out of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. It's the same reason that the Russian right embraces Joseph Stalin. And so, given that the Russian political spectrum is all screwy, I think it's safe to exclude Russian nationalists from our search for right-wing Holodomor deniers.
The reason there are left-wing Holocaust deniers, but not right-wing Holodomor deniers, is quite simple. Political incentives.
I've already laid out the incentives for left-wing Holocaust denial. They portray the story of the Holocaust as a kind of pro-capitalist propaganda saying, at least we're not them. In contrast, what incentives is there for a right-winger outside of Russia to deny the Holodomor? The entirety of the right, from the center to the far right, hates communists for one reason or another. The Holodomor is a crime committed by a communist state under a communist dictatorship in the name of central economic planning. There's literally no reason for any right-winger outside of Russia to deny the Holodomor. Even the softest interpretation of the Holodomor, that it was just an unforeseen failure of policy, is evidence enough that Soviet communism was at best disastrous and should never be tried anywhere ever again. And when you add in the evidence that Stalin knew he was going to make the famine worse, you make Stalin, the Soviet Union, and communism in general look just as bad as the Nazis.
But in the West today, Holodomor denial is largely limited to hard lefties on the internet. They call themselves Marxist-Leninists, the rest of us call them tankies. What is a tankie, you ask? Well,
the term originated amongst British communists in the 1950s and 60s. Those that supported the Soviet Union's crushing of the Hungarian Revolution in 1956, or the Prague Spring of 1968, were called tankies, after the tanks the Warsaw Pact sent in. On the internet today, tankies refer to, most specifically, apologists for Joseph Stalin, more generally apologists for the Soviet Union, and more broadly apologists for communist dictatorships. They hold to strict doublespeak and shifting goalposts, in order to ensure their political side can't be labeled with the same pejoratives they label others with. For example, to a tankie, communist countries, by definition, can't be imperialists or colonialists. If they do something that looks like imperialism or colonialism, it either magically becomes not imperialism, or the country wasn't really communists, even if every other box is checked.
Now, similar to neo-Nazis, tankies make up a minority of the modern political left in most countries. And before you ask, trying to tabulate which side has a bigger or more problem with their respective crazies is kind of a fool's errand to try and tabulate that. And you're better off just equally condemning both sides in this case. But this is where some on the non-extreme left become somewhat problematic.
There are some members of the left that, although they themselves are not tankies, are quite soft on them. Certain content creators online, such as Re-Education or David Parkman, have both talked about tankies in a way that, although not endorsing their positions, have made it clear that they would rather have them on their side than risk pushing them to the far right in any attempt to reform them. And this isn't an uncommon attitude. And outside the realm of the internet, the Bernie Sanders campaign had a real problem with tankies in its ranks, a phenomena also seen back in the 2016 campaign. Bernie Sanders' apologetics for the Soviet Union and Castro are also strong tankie bait, and depending on how narrow or broad of a definition you use, the Vermont senator himself could be called a tankie.
Another problem that the modern left has is its usage of Soviet propaganda in its political discourse.
The labeling of everything they oppose as being racism, fascism, or Nazism is taken straight out of post-war Soviet propaganda. Starting with the Holodomor, any negative take on the Soviet Union was referred to as fascist propaganda. The modern left has used and abused this tactic so much that it's a meme. They've done it so much that Godwin's Law became a thing. They did it so much that people don't take the accusation seriously anymore. Similar to how calling someone a communist or socialist doesn't pack the same punch it once did. The difference being, if you call someone a Nazi, that person knows to deny it. But if you call someone a communist or a socialist as a means of silencing them, there's a non-zero chance that they will say yes.
I haven't covered the whole story. There's so much I could have added, but it would have sounded just like more of the same. I hope what you got from this video is more than just the story of a particular tragedy and the reactions to it, but rather a story of human weakness, of our susceptibility to defend the indefensible because the perpetrator is on our side, or because the victims are on the other side. That those in positions of power and influence really do have the ability to silence inconvenient stories and have the lies held up as gospel truth for decades. Thank you for taking the time to listen to this story, and more importantly, to absorb these lessons. A big risk this video is taking is that it is standing underneath the Damocles that is demonetization. And so, I was wondering if you could maybe help overcome these possible shackles by sharing the video, giving it a like, leaving a comment. That would help overcome some of the hurdles that YouTube might put before it. And on the note of demonetization, if you have the ability to financially support this channel, I would ask you to do so. You can do so at, say, patreon.com/casualhistorian, where as little as $1 a month will get you early access to these videos before they're public for anyone else. You can also support this channel through contributions on PayPal, buying merch, or getting something through the Amazon affiliate link below. Links to all of those things can be found in the description. So thank you to my patrons for helping make this video possible. I would also like to thank all the other YouTubers who contributed voice work to this video. They helped make it more immersive by having it not just be my voice for 2 hours straight. Even I can't take that. So Thank you very much to them, thank you to the patrons, and thank you to my subscribers and everyone watching this video for putting up with over 2 hours at this point, I think, I'm not exactly sure, of content about a genocide. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time.